Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime Historian. Tonight we're stepping far back into the late 1600, where daily life was messy, smelly, and occasionally deadly. Imagine the narrow streets of Bristol, England, crowded with carts and shouting porters. The air carries the sharp smell of tar, fish, and wood smoke. Tall masted ships line the docks, their hulls creaking as the tide rises and falls. This is the world into which a boy named Edward Teach was born, sometime around 1680. No one recorded the exact day or even the precise year, which was common enough for families of modest means. His father was most likely a sailor or a dock worker, the kind of man who left home for months at a stretch and returned with salt-stained clothes and stories of distant ports. His mother kept a small household together, stretching every penny and every scrap of food. Young Edward would have grown up hearing the constant noise of the harbour, the clatter of chains, the calls of gulls, the heavy thump of barrels being rolled along the quay. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Wherever you are tonight, drop a quick comment with your city and the local time. I always enjoy seeing where these stories find you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year was around 1680, when a boy named Edward Teach first appeared in the records of Bristol, a crowded port city in the west of England, where the River Avon met the Severn estuary and opened onto the wider world. Bristol was then one of the busiest harbours in the kingdom, second only to London in the volume of ships that tied up along its quays. Tobacco from Virginia, sugar from the West Indies, wine from Portugal, and African goods carried under increasingly regulated triangular trade routes all passed through these waters. The streets behind the docks were narrow, cobbled, and perpetually damp from river mist and frequent rain. Timber-framed houses leaned close together, their upper stories almost touching, while the ground floors housed taverns, chandlers, sailmakers, and coopers whose hammers rang from dawn until well after dark. Edward grew up in this environment of constant movement. His family circumstances remain unclear. Some parish records hint at a father who may have worked as a minor mariner or shipwright. Others suggest modest trade connections, but no grand lineage survives. He was likely one of several children in a household that lived close to the water's edge, where every meal carried the faint taste of salt, and every conversation turned sooner or later to the next convoy or the price of hemp. Boys in such neighbourhoods learned early that survival meant understanding ropes, knots, weather signs, and the unspoken hierarchy of men who worked the ships. By his early teens, Edward was already spending long hours on the quays. He carried messages between captains and merchants, ran errands for ship's cooks, and sometimes helped load barrels when extra hands were needed. The work was hard and paid little, but it brought him close to the men who actually sailed. They spoke of storms off the banks, of Spanish guardacostas chasing sloops near Havana, of ports where a sailor could spend a year's wages in a single night. These stories were not romantic. They were practical warnings and occasional boasts delivered between mouthfuls of salt, beef, and biscuit. Bristol itself was changing during these years. The late Stuart period brought political unease after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when William of Orange replaced James II. The city had backed the new king, but trade suffered from French privateers during the 9 Years' War. Merchants pushed for stronger naval escorts, and Parliament responded with acts that encouraged privateering legalised attacks on enemy shipping during wartime. Young Edward would have seen posters nailed to tavern doors offering shares in privateering ventures, promising prize money far beyond ordinary seamen's wages. The promise stayed in the air even when the ships returned empty-handed or not at all. Daily life followed the rhythm of the tides and the arrival of vessels. Mornings began with the cry of street sellers hawking oysters, hot rolls, and small beer. Apprentices swept shop fronts while their masters inspected incoming cargoes. In the afternoons, the quays grew loud with the unloading of hogsheads and crates. Ropes hissed through blocks, chains rattled, and 4 men shouted orders in accents from Cornwall to the Orkneys. Evenings brought sailors ashore, Scots, Irish, Welsh, and increasingly men from farther afield who had been pressed or simply signed on for adventure. Taverns served strong West Country cider, rum punch when sugar ships were in, and boiled mutton or fish stew thickened with ship's biscuit when money ran short. Edward developed a tall, broad-shouldered frame early. Contemporary descriptions, though written much later, agree he was unusually large for the time, well over 6 feet, when most sailors stood closer to 5.5. His strength helped him move quickly from errand boy to deckhand. By his late teens he was making short coastal runs to London, Plymouth, and occasionally up to Liverpool, learning the feel of different vessels, the quick, shallow draught sloops that hugged the shore, the broader merchantmen that crossed the Atlantic, the occasional naval frigate that anchored with greater ceremony. He was quiet among the older hands, observant rather than talkative. Shipboard life demanded obedience, and he gave it without complaint. Yet he listened carefully when captains discussed routes, winds, currents, and the best ways to evade customs officers or hostile privateers. He watched how experienced men tied knots that would hold in a gale, how they judged a sail set by the way it filled, how they rationed water and powder when supplies ran low. These were not abstract lessons. They were the difference between reaching port and drifting for weeks on short allowance. The political currents of the time touched even a young sailor's world. The 1690s saw England locked in war with France, and Bristol merchants lost ships to enemy raiders. The government responded by issuing letters of marque more freely, turning merchant vessels into temporary warships. Edward likely witnessed the return of some of these privateers' vessels flying the red ensign rather than the black, their crews richer but scarred. The money changed hands quickly in the waterfront taverns, and the stories spread faster still. By the early years of the new century, Edward had made several longer voyages. He crossed to the American colonies at least once, probably carrying tobacco or manufactured goods outward and returning with sugar, indigo, or logwood. The Atlantic passage took 6 to 10 weeks depending on season and weather. Passengers and crew alike suffered cramped quarters, weevilly biscuit, and the constant threat of scurvy. Edward endured these conditions without recorded complaint. He learned to sleep in a hammock that swayed with every roll, to eat standing when the deck was too crowded for sitting, and to judge a man's character by how he behaved when the food ran short. He also began to understand the wider forces shaping the maritime world. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 would soon end the War of the Spanish Succession, but before that came years of steady conflict. Privateering offered a path out of ordinary seamen's wages, often no more than 20 shillings a month, towards shares of captured prizes that could reach hundreds of pounds for a single successful cruise. The risk was high, but so was the reward, and for a young man with no land or trade to inherit, the arithmetic made sense. In Bristol, the streets smelled of pitch, oakum, and horse manure. Lanterns swung from shop signs after dusk, casting moving shadows on wet stone. Watchmen called the hours, and the occasional press gang moved quietly through alleys looking for able-bodied men to fill naval quotas. Edward avoided those sweeps, perhaps by staying aboard ship or by keeping to the shadows when the Navy frigates were recruiting. He preferred the merchant service, where discipline was strict but not brutal, and where a skilled hand could rise through steady work. Around 1710, in his early 30s, Edward Teach stood at a quiet crossroads. He had learned the trade thoroughly: navigation by dead reckoning, basic gunnery, sail handling, and the unspoken codes that kept crews from murdering one another during long voyages. He had seen enough of the world to know that ordinary merchant service offered security but little wealth, while wartime privateering offered the opposite. The next few years would decide which path he followed. The city continued its steady pulse around him. Ships arrived and departed. Cargoes were tallied, duties paid, crews paid off. Edward remained part of that rhythm, tall and quiet, watching, waiting, and learning. Maritime apprenticeship. The decision came quietly in the spring of 1701. Edward Teach signed articles aboard a merchant brig bound for the West Indies, leaving the familiar Bristol quays behind for the longer Atlantic crossing. At roughly 21 years old, he carried little beyond a change of clothes, a sheath knife, and the practical knowledge he had gathered from shorter coastal runs. The ship was the sort common in those years, a two-masted vessel of about 100 tons, broad in the beam for cargo, with a crew of 22, including boys and older hands. Her holds were filled with English woolens, iron goods, and barrels of nails destined for planters in Barbados and Jamaica. In return, the owners hoped for sugar, rum, and perhaps a few hogsheads of indigo that could be sold at a profit back home. Life aboard settled into a rhythm that would shape the next decade of his existence. The day began at 4 bells in the morning watch, when the cook lit the galley fire and the watch on deck pumped the bilges. Edward stood his turn at the helm, feeling the wheel's resistance through his palms as the brig rose and fell on the long Atlantic swells. Navigation relied on dead reckoning, estimating speed through the water with a chip log thrown astern, noting direction by compass, and marking progress on a slate. The captain, a weathered man from Plymouth named Jonas Hargrove, taught the younger hands how to correct their course for leeway and current without ever raising his voice above the wind. Edward absorbed these lessons the way others absorbed rum. He asked few questions but remembered every correction. Meals were simple and unchanging. Breakfast was oatmeal boiled with salt pork scraps. Dinner a stew of salt beef and peas thickened with ship's biscuit, and supper whatever remained from the day. Water was rationed to a pint per man once the casks grew stale, and the crew chewed tobacco or sucked on lemons when scurvy signs appeared. Clothing consisted of loose canvas trousers, a checked shirt, and a wool jacket that grew heavier with salt and grease. Shoes were rare. Most men went barefoot on deck to keep their footing when the ship heeled. Edward's large frame made him useful at the capstan and when tacking the heavy yards, but he also learned to splice rope with the same care a watchmaker gave to gears. His hands developed thick calluses that never quite softened again. The crew around him came from every corner of the British Isles and beyond. There were Scots pressed from fishing boats, Irishmen escaping poverty, a few Welshmen who sang in the dog watch, and even a Dutchman who had jumped ship in London. Conversations in the forecastle turned to wages, prize shares, and the latest news from Europe. In 1701 the political situation was tense. King William III had died, and Queen Anne now sat on the throne. War with France and Spain seemed certain over the question of who would inherit the Spanish Empire. Merchants in Bristol and Liverpool were already fitting out vessels with extra guns and hiring men who could fight as well as sail. Edward listened without comment, but the talk planted a seed. Ordinary seamen earned about 24 shillings a month. A successful privateer could clear 10 times that in a single cruise if the prizes were good. Storms tested everyone. One October gale, in the latitude of the Azores, caught the brig under reduced sail. Waves broke over the waist, sweeping loose gear overboard. Edward and 2 others were sent aloft to secure the fore topsail that had begun to slat violently. The yard bucked beneath their feet, the canvas cracked like gunfire, and the wind drove rain horizontally into their faces. They fought the sail down and lashed it with numbed fingers while the ship rolled so far that the yardarm nearly touched the water. When they reached the deck again, the captain simply nodded once. No praise, no blame. That was the merchant service. Edward wiped salt from his eyes and realized he had stopped feeling afraid during the worst of it. Fear took energy that was better saved for work. Ports of call offered brief windows of different life. In Bridgetown, Barbados, the heat struck like a furnace after weeks at sea. The crew was given shore leave in small groups. They walked streets lined with whitewashed warehouses and taverns roofed with palm thatch. Rum was cheap, fresh fruit abundant, and the air carried the scent of molasses and wood smoke. Edward tasted mango for the first time and watched enslaved workers loading hogsheads onto lighters. The contrast between shipboard equality, where every man shared the same rations and danger, and the rigid hierarchies ashore stayed with him. He spent his few coins on a new shirt and a small brass compass that he kept in a leather pouch around his neck. Back aboard, the return cargo of sugar made the ship sit lower and roll more heavily, but the knowledge that their pay would be higher eased the discomfort. The years passed in a cycle of crossings. Edward moved from brig to snow to full-rigged ship as his reputation for steady work grew. In 1703 he was aboard a vessel trading between Jamaica and the American colonies, carrying logwood and returning with barrel staves and saltfish. Boston Harbour in winter was a forest of masts iced over, the waterfront taverns filled with men speaking in broad Yankee accents. New York offered a more chaotic mix of Dutch, English and Huguenot merchants. Everywhere the talk was the same. The war had begun in earnest. Privateers were returning to Bristol and Liverpool with French and Spanish prizes, rich cargoes of wine, silk and silver plate. Wages for ordinary seamen rose slightly, but the real money lay in the letters of marque now being issued by the dozen. Edward's inner life during these years remained private. He kept a small notebook in which he copied tables of latitude and rough sketches of coastlines. He practised with a quadrant when the captain allowed, learning to measure the sun's altitude at noon. His ambition was not yet formed into words, but he knew he did not want to spend his life hauling cargo for other men's profit, while his own share barely covered boots and tobacco. He watched captains who owned shares in their vessels grow prosperous, and he noted how some officers carried themselves with quiet authority that owed nothing to birth and everything to competence. These observations accumulated like the layers of oakum between a ship's planks. By 1705, he had crossed the Atlantic at least 8 times. His body had hardened into the frame later descriptions would call formidable. He stood 6'3" in his stockings, broad across the shoulders, with a full black beard that he trimmed short while at sea. The beard was practical. It kept his face warm in the North Atlantic and gave him a presence among the crew. He developed the habit of chewing tobacco slowly, letting the juice sit in his cheek while he calculated distances or watched the set of the sails. The men respected his strength and his silence. When a drunken sailor picked a fight in a Jamaican tavern, Edward ended it with 2 measured blows and no lasting grudge. Word travelled that Teach was a man best left alone. England's naval expansion touched even the merchant service. The Royal Navy was growing rapidly, building ships of the line and pressing men from the waterfronts. Bristol saw more frigates anchoring in the roads, their gun ports painted black and yellow. Press gangs worked the taverns after dark, and Edward learned to sleep aboard ship when a man-of-war was in port. He had no desire to serve under the Articles of War with their catto, 9-tails and hanging offences. Merchant captains might be strict, but they rarely flogged a willing hand, and the food, though poor, was never the Navy's infamous salt horse. In the summer of 1706, the brig he sailed on was chartered to carry naval stores to the fleet, assembling at Plymouth. For the first time Edward saw the full might of the English Navy at anchor. Rows of 2-deckers with their lower gun ports closed against the tide, longboats moving between them like water beetles. The sight stirred something in him. These were the ships that would fight the French and Spanish for control of the Caribbean and the Atlantic trade routes. The war had already shifted the balance of power at sea, and every merchant sailor felt the change in escort availability and in the prices paid for captured goods. His habits ashore remained simple. He avoided the more expensive brothels and gambling houses, preferring a quiet corner in a chandler's tavern where he could listen to returning privateers spin their yarns. One man described taking a Spanish galleon off Cartagena with only 20 hands against 80. Another spoke of the silver bars stacked like cordwood in the prize's hold. Edward stored these accounts away. He was not yet ready to risk everything, but the mathematics were becoming clear. A privateer's articles gave each man a full share after the owners took their cut. A single good prize could equal 5 years of merchant wages. The following year, he signed aboard a larger vessel trading to Virginia. The Chesapeake Bay was a different world wide, muddy rivers lined with tobacco plantations, the air heavy with the smell of curing leaf. Crews went ashore to help roll hogsheads down to the wharves. Edward worked alongside enslaved labourers whose lives were bound to the crop in ways he could scarcely imagine. The experience deepened his sense that the entire Atlantic economy rested on unequal foundations, yet he said nothing. His focus remained on the sea and the skills that might one day let him choose his own course. By late 1708, Edward Teach had become a reliable mate on several vessels. Captains sought him out because he could handle a watch without supervision, and because he never lost his head in a blow. He had learned to judge a ship's trim by the way she sailed, to anticipate squalls from the colour of the sky at sunset, and to maintain discipline among a mixed crew without raising his voice. His fears, storms, disease, financial ruin had not disappeared, but they no longer dominated his thoughts. In their place sat a steady calculation. The war was entering its final years, privateering commissions were still being granted, and the Caribbean offered opportunities that Bristol wages could never match. The apprenticeship was nearly complete. The next step would take him beyond the merchant service and into the armed vessels that blurred the line between trade and war. Edward Teach stood on the quarterdeck of a Snow anchored in Kingston Harbour, one humid evening in 1709, watching the sun set behind the Blue Mountains, and made his choice. When the ship paid off in Bristol the following spring, he would not sign for another merchant voyage. The sea had taught him everything it could under peaceful articles. Now he would test himself under the rules of war. War of Spanish Succession Edward Teach stepped ashore in Bristol in the early weeks of 1710, with his pay from the last merchant voyage tucked inside a canvas belt. The city looked the same wet stone, the smell of tar and river mud, but something had shifted inside him. The decision he had reached in Kingston Harbour now felt solid. He walked straight to the offices of a merchant house near the quay that was fitting out a privateer. The vessel was the Queen Anne's Revenge in name only at this stage. She was actually a sloop of about 90 tons, recently purchased from a sugar trader and being pierced for 12 guns. Her captain, a man named Benjamin Hornigold, who had already made several successful cruises, was hiring hands who could fight as well as sail. Teach's size and quiet competence got him signed on as an able seaman with the promise of an extra quarter share if he proved useful at the guns. The articles were read aloud on the deck before the ship cleared the dock. Each man would receive one full share of any prizes after the owners took their cut and the captain his too. Wounded men received compensation from a common fund, 600 pieces of 8 for the loss of a right arm, 400 for a leg. No man was to strike another aboard ship. Disputes waited until they reached land. The rules were clear and fairer than anything Teach had known in the merchant service. The crew numbered 60, a mixed group of Bristol men, a few from Liverpool and some who had drifted down from London after naval service. They loaded powder, shot, and provisions with the knowledge that this voyage carried real risk, but also real possibility. The sloop slipped down the Avon on the morning tide in late February. The war, now in its 9th year, had turned the Caribbean into a hunting ground. French and Spanish merchant ships still crossed the Atlantic in small convoys, and the waters around the Windward Islands offered plenty of targets. Teach stood his watch at the helm as the ship cleared the Bristol Channel and met the open sea. The difference from merchant life was immediate. Lookouts were doubled, the guns were exercised every morning, and every man practised with cutlass and pistol on the main deck. Powder was issued sparingly for drill, but the smell of it lingered in the air like a promise. Life settled into a new pattern. Days began with the same ship's bell, but the work mixed seamanship with preparation for combat. Teach helped mount the carriage guns, learning how to secure them against the roll and how much elevation to give for a shot at 1,000 yards. The cook still boiled salt beef, but now there was occasional issue of rum, half a pint a day, when the captain felt the crew needed steadying. Clothing remained practical, loose trousers, checked shirts, and a Monmouth cap. Teach kept his beard trimmed short, but let it grow fuller than before. It marked him as a man who had chosen this life. In the forecastle, the talk was of previous prizes: French sugar ships taken off Martinique, Spanish wine cargoes seized near Puerto Rico. No one boasted. They simply calculated shares. The first weeks at sea were spent working the ship into fighting trim. Hornigold drilled the crew in boarding tactics, dividing them into parties with specific tasks: one to secure the enemy's deck, another to go below for the strong room, a third to man the pumps if the hull was holed. Teach was placed with the gun crew on the starboard battery. He learned to judge the moment when the ship's roll brought the target into the sights, to sponge the barrel, load the cartridge, and step clear before the gun captain touched the match. The noise and smoke were new, but his steady hands kept the piece from jumping out of battery. They raised the island of Madeira in April and watered there before turning southwest toward the Caribbean. The crossing passed without incident, though one man fell from the rigging and broke his arm. The articles paid him out immediately in coin taken from the ship's chest. Teach spent his off-watch hours studying the charts Hornigold kept in the great cabin. The captain was open with his officers about routes and likely hunting grounds. Teach absorbed the information silently, noting how the trade winds shaped the sailing paths and how the Spanish floaters still tried to slip through despite the war. The first capture came off the coast of Hispaniola in May. A small French brigantine loaded with coffee and indigo was sighted running before the wind. Hornigold hoisted British colours and fired a gun across her bow. The Frenchman struck without a fight. Teach boarded with the prize crew, feeling the unfamiliar deck under his feet. The French captain, a thin man with a worried expression, handed over his papers without protest. The cargo was modest, but the vessel itself was sound. Hornigold decided to keep her as a tender, and Teach was among those chosen to sail her back to the main ship. The experience taught him how quickly a prize could change hands, and how little resistance most merchantmen offered when faced with armed sloops. Over the next 18 months, the privateer took 7 more prizes. Some were French coastal traders carrying salt and wine. One was a Spanish packet with letters of credit that brought a decent sum when sold in Jamaica. Each capture followed a similar pattern: sighting, chase, surrender, boarding, inventory, and division. Teach's share grew steadily. He sent small amounts back to Bristol when the ship touched at Port Royal, but most of his money stayed with him in a locked chest. He developed the habit of counting his coins quietly at night, calculating what another year of this life might bring. The fear of battle never fully left him, but it became manageable, like the fear of a storm, something to prepare for rather than dwell on. The crew changed over time. Men were wounded, others took their shares and left at Kingston or Antigua. New hands came aboard, some from captured vessels who chose to join rather than go to prison. A few runaway indentured servants from the plantations. Teach watched how Hornigold handled these newcomers. The captain was firm but not cruel. He offered rum to celebrate a prize and withheld it when discipline slipped. The political realities of the war shaped every decision. Queen Anne's government in London wanted French and Spanish trade disrupted, and the privateers were cheaper than the Royal Navy for that work. Yet the crews knew that peace, when it came, would end their commissions overnight. Daily existence carried the constant awareness of risk. They cruised the Windward Passage, the Mona Passage, and the waters off Cartagena. Heat in the tropics made sleeping below impossible. Men slung hammocks on deck under an awning. Food improved when they captured livestock chickens, a goat, once a small herd of pigs from a Spanish coaster. Teach developed a taste for fresh turtle meat stewed with yams and peppers bought from local fishermen. Clothing wore out faster in the sun and salt. He replaced his shirt 3 times in a single year, buying plain linen from prize goods. In the spring of 1712, the sloop was careened on a quiet beach in the Bahamas. The crew hauled her ashore, burned the weed and barnacles from her bottom, and recorked the seams. Teach worked with the others, scraping and painting, while lookouts watched for Spanish patrols. The weeks on land gave him time to think. He walked the white sand beaches at dusk, feeling the trade wind on his face, and realized that the sea had become more than a way to earn money. It offered a kind of freedom he had never known in Bristol, freedom from fixed wages, from owners who never saw the risks, from the press gangs that still haunted English ports. The war was winding down. News reached them in late 1712 that preliminary articles of peace had been signed in Utrecht. Prizes became rarer. Hornigold decided to head for Jamaica, to sell the last captured goods and pay off the crew. Teach's accumulated share came to nearly £300 more money than he had ever seen in one place. He could have returned to Bristol, a wealthy man by the standards of the waterfront, bought a small public house or a share in a coaster. Instead, he stayed in the Caribbean. The peace treaty might end legal privateering, but the sea still held opportunities for those willing to bend the new rules. The final cruise ended in the spring of 1713. The sloop returned to Port Royal with her guns silent and her hold empty of new prizes. Hornigold announced that the commission would not be renewed. The crew dispersed quietly. Some signed on to naval vessels now that the fleet needed men less urgently. Others drifted toward the smaller islands looking for work. Teach collected his final share and walked the streets of Kingston for the first time as a man without articles. The town was noisy with returning soldiers and sailors, the taverns full, the air thick with the smell of rum and frying fish. He felt no regret about the years just past. They had taught him gunnery, leadership by example, and the simple truth that a crew worked best when every man believed the rules were fair. The War of the Spanish Succession had ended on paper, but its effects lingered in the Caribbean like smoke after a broadside. Former privateers now faced a choice: return to merchant service at reduced wages or find another way to use the skills they had learned. Edward Teach, taller and quieter than ever, with a full black beard and a small fortune in his belt, chose to wait and watch. The next chapter of his life would not be written under a royal commission. It would be written under different colours entirely. Post-war challenges, the Treaty of Utrecht was signed in the spring of 1713, and within weeks the news reached every harbour from Kingston to Nassau. Privateering commissions were revoked, and the armed sloops that had hunted French and Spanish traders were suddenly without legal purpose. Edward Teach collected his final pay from Hornigold in Port Royal and watched as men who had fought beside him scattered in different directions. Some returned to England on merchant ships, hoping for steady wages now that the navy no longer pressed so hard. Others signed on to whalers bound for the northern fisheries. A few lingered in Jamaica, drinking their shares and waiting for something to change. Teach chose neither path. He had money in his belt enough to live quietly for a year or two, but the idea of returning to hauling cargo for a captain who never saw the deck felt like stepping backward. The Caribbean after the war settled into an uneasy calm. The Royal Navy kept a presence in Port Royal and Barbados, but its ships were stretched thin, patrolling trade routes that no longer faced the same level of enemy threat. Spanish guardacostas still cruised the main, and French privateers occasionally ignored the peace when a fat prize appeared, but the large-scale disruption had ended. For former privateers, the change was immediate and harsh. Wages for ordinary seamen dropped back to pre-war levels, often less than 20 shillings a month with no prospect of prize money. Merchants hired fewer hands, preferring to wait out the uncertain months rather than risk unprofitable voyages. Unemployment spread along the waterfronts like rot in wet timber. Teach spent the summer months in Nassau, a small settlement on New Providence Island in the Bahamas. The place had grown during the war as a convenient stop for privateers needing water, wood, and repairs. Shallow harbours protected vessels from heavy weather, and the island's position placed it near the Florida Straits and the Gulf Stream routes used by homeward-bound Spanish treasure fleets and English traders alike. By 1713, Nassau consisted of a few dozen wooden houses, a tavern or two, a careening beach, and a collection of tents and shacks occupied by sailors who had nowhere else to go. The British governor in the Bahamas had little authority. His salary was small, his garrison smaller, and the island lay far from the main colonial centres. Law existed mostly on paper. Daily life in Nassau followed no fixed schedule. Men rose when the sun grew hot, worked when a ship needed hands, and drank when money or credit allowed. Food came from fishing, from small gardens of yams and plantains, and from occasional trading with passing vessels. Turtle was plentiful, caught from small boats using nets or speared in the shallows. Rum flowed freely, distilled locally from molasses or brought in by Bermudan sloops. Clothing was whatever remained after years at sea: faded shirts, patched trousers, bare feet on the hot sand. Teach kept to himself at first, renting a small room above a tavern where he could watch the harbour from a shuttered window. He spent his days walking the beach, examining stranded wrecks, and listening to the talk around the cooking fires. The men around him carried the same sense of dislocation. Many were in their 20s and 30s, skilled seamen with no land to return to and no trade beyond the one they had practiced during wartime. Some had families in England or the colonies who depended on remittances that no longer arrived. Others had burned their bridges deserted from naval service, quarrelled with captains, or simply preferred the loose society of the islands to the rigid hierarchies ashore. Conversations turned often to the old days, the thrill of a chase, the weight of silver bars in the hold, the moment when a merchant captain struck his colours. The stories were told without exaggeration, simply as facts that had once meant full pockets and full bellies. Teach observed how quickly the money disappeared. A man who had cleared £400 from a single prize could run through it in months, spending on rum, gambling, women who arrived on trading sloops, or repairs to small boats they hoped to use for fishing. Debt followed, then reliance on credit from tavern keepers who charged exorbitant rates. When credit ran out, men turned to odd jobs, careening hulls for passing captains, loading salt at the pans on nearby islands, or joining short voyages to cut logwood on the Mosquito Coast. The work paid poorly and carried its own risks. Spanish patrols still captured logwood cutters and sent them to prison in Havana. Political forces continued to shape the picture. The Treaty of Utrecht had redrawn colonial boundaries. Britain gained Gibraltar, Minorca, and the Asiento, the monopoly right to supply slaves to Spanish America. France kept its Caribbean islands but lost some territory in Canada. Spain retained control of the treasure fleets, but agreed to peace terms that favoured British trade. In practice, the Asiento opened new opportunities for smuggling, and Nassau became a convenient base for those who wished to bypass Spanish customs. The British government in London paid little attention to the Bahamas. The colony was distant, poor, and troublesome. Governors came and went, often leaving after a few months when fever or frustration took hold. Teach's habits during these months were steady and deliberate. He avoided heavy drinking, preferring to nurse a single mug of rum, while others grew loud. He kept his money hidden in several places, some buried in oilskin pouches near the beach, some carried in a belt. He maintained his equipment, sharpening his cutlass, oiling his pistols, mending sails he had salvaged from wrecks. His beard grew longer now that no captain required it trimmed. It reached his chest in thick black strands that he occasionally braided when the wind was strong. The change was practical as well as personal. The beard helped shield his face from sun and spray, and it gave him a distinctive appearance that men remembered. He began to form quiet alliances. A few men from the old Hornigold cruises approached him with ideas, small ventures to salvage wrecks, short trading runs to nearby quays, or simply pooling resources to buy a sloop outright. Teach listened without committing. He knew that outright piracy attacking any vessel without commission was now a hanging offence under English law, but the line between legal salvage, smuggling, and robbery had always been thin in these waters. The lack of regular naval patrols made enforcement almost impossible. A ship could take a prize, strip it, and disappear among the thousands of quays before any authority arrived. By late 1714, the situation in Nassau had hardened. More men arrived, former privateers from other colonies, deserters from merchant ships, even a few escaped indentured servants who had crossed from the Carolinas in stolen boats. The settlement grew to several hundred souls, most living in makeshift shelters of palm thatch and driftwood. Food became scarcer as fishing grounds were overworked and gardens failed in the poor soil. Sickness spread: dysentery from bad water, fevers from mosquitoes that bred in standing pools after rain, Teach survived by staying active, fishing with a handline from the rocks, trading fresh catch for bread or rum, helping careen vessels for a share of the work. One evening, in early 1715, he joined a small group around a fire on the beach. The talk turned to the recent arrival of a Spanish treasure fleet that had wrecked off the Florida coast the previous summer. Coins and bars had washed ashore, and salvors from several colonies were already working the wrecks under dubious Spanish permission. The story interested Teach. Salvage was legal if one obtained a warrant, but in practice many simply helped themselves. The distance to Florida was manageable in a fast sloop, and the rewards could be substantial. He listened carefully as men described the location: shallow reefs near the shore, easy to reach but dangerous in a blow. The idea took root slowly. Teach began to gather tools: a sounding lead, spare cordage, a few small anchors for working close inshore. He spoke quietly with 2 or 3 men he trusted from the old days, capable hands who knew how to handle a small vessel and keep their mouths shut. They pooled what money remained and purchased a sloop of about 30 tons from a Bermudan trader who had grown tired of the islands. The vessel was sound but plain, no figurehead, no fancy paint, just a clean hull and a single mast rigged fore and aft. They named her informally the Revenge, though no formal christening took place. In the spring of 1715, Teach and his small crew cleared Nassau, bound for the Florida wrecks. The voyage was short, 3 days of fair winds, and they arrived to find the coast already busy with salvors. Spanish officials had established a camp, but their control was weak. English boats worked alongside them, often paying a small fee for the privilege of diving the wrecks. Teach's group joined the activity. They anchored well offshore, used small boats to reach the shallows, and spent long days in the water searching for scattered cargo. The work was exhausting, holding breath, prying open chests with crowbars, hauling heavy silver bars through the surf, but the rewards came quickly. A single good find could yield hundreds of pieces of 8. Teach proved methodical. He marked locations with buoys, noted depths and currents, and kept careful account of every coin or bar brought aboard. His share was equal to the others, but he insisted on clear records to prevent disputes. The experience reinforced what he already knew. Organisation and discipline turned chance into profit. By summer they had accumulated a respectable haul, not enough to retire, but enough to refit the sloop and consider longer ventures. The return to Nassau brought a changed atmosphere. The settlement had grown more lawless in their absence. Fights broke out over women and rum, theft was common, and the few remaining officials stayed inside their stockade. Teach saw the pattern clearly. Without steady work or authority, men turned inward, preying on one another. He kept his crew small and loyal, paying them promptly and treating them fairly. The sloop was careened again, her bottom cleaned, her rigging renewed. Teach's beard was now a full, dark curtain that reached his waist when loose. He tied it back during work, but let it hang free ashore, a silent marker of the man he had become. By late 1715, the Bahamas had become a refuge for those who no longer fit anywhere else. The governor in Nassau had little power to enforce order, and London seemed content to ignore the distant colony. Teach understood the opportunity. The same conditions that made life difficult sparse authority, scattered islands, busy trade routes, also made it possible to operate beyond the reach of law. He had no grand plan yet, only a growing certainty that the sea still held ways to earn a living, even if those ways now carried different names. The post-war years had stripped away illusions. Peace brought no golden age for the men who had fought it. Instead, it brought empty pockets, idle hands, and the quiet realization that skills learned in war did not vanish with the treaties. Edward Teach, standing on the deck of his small sloop one evening as the sun dropped behind the quays, felt the familiar pull of the horizon. The next move would not be salvage or trade. It would be something older, simpler, and far more direct. Arrival in Nassau. The sloop made the short run back from the Florida wrecks in 3 days of steady trade winds, and dropped anchor in Nassau harbour late one afternoon in October 1715. The settlement that greeted Teach upon his return was no longer the quiet collection of shacks he had known from earlier stays. Word of the Spanish wreck had spread along the coast, and men had poured in from every direction, former privateers from Jamaica, deserters from merchant ships in Barbados, even a handful of escaped labourers from the Carolina rice fields. The population had swollen to well over 1,000 souls, with more than 40 vessels of various sizes riding at anchor or beached for repairs. No governor's flag flew anywhere. The last appointed official had sailed away months earlier, complaining of fever and unpaid salary, leaving behind an empty stockade and a single rusty cannon. Teach waded ashore through the warm shallows, carrying his portion of the silver in a heavy canvas sack slung over his shoulder. The beach was alive with activity that had its own loose order. Groups of men dragged logs to build new shelters, others hauled fresh water from inland springs in barrels lashed to poles, and small boats ferried supplies between the anchored ships. The air held the sharp tang of fresh-caught fish grilling over driftwood fires, mixed with the sweeter smoke of tobacco and the ever-present salt breeze. No one demanded papers or questioned his right to be there. In Nassau, a man's pass stayed at sea. What mattered was whether he could pull his weight and keep his word. He found a spot near the eastern end of the harbour where the sand gave way to low scrub. Using timbers salvaged from an old wreck and palm fronds for roofing, he and 2 crewmates from the Florida trip put up a simple shelter in a single day. Inside he hung his hammock, stowed his chest of clothes and weapons, and placed the silver under the floorboards wrapped in oilcloth. The arrangement was temporary but functional, the same as hundreds of others around him. Life here followed the rhythm of the tides rather than any clock. At dawn the harbour filled with the sound of caulking mallets and saws as crews worked on their hulls during low water. Teach joined one such party the next morning, scraping weed from a brigantine's bottom and paying for the labour with a handful of the coins he had just brought back. The work left his arms aching, but gave him a place among the men without drawing attention. Food was straightforward and plentiful, if a man was willing to help gather it. Fishing lines went out every morning from small dugouts, and the catch grunts, snapper, and the occasional barracuda was divided among whoever showed up to clean and cook. Turtle meat appeared when boats returned from the quays, stewed with wild onions and hot peppers in iron pots set over coals. Bread came from cassava roots pounded into flour, baked into flat cakes that kept for days in the dry air. Rum was the universal drink, bought from Bermudan traders or distilled on the spot from molasses barrels. Men watered it heavily to make it last, and no one drank alone. Sharing a mug was the basic courtesy that kept arguments from starting. The community around Teach was building its own way of living, without outside interference. Captains who had known one another from the war years gathered under a large shade tree each evening to discuss routes and targets. They drew up simple articles for any voyage that required more than one ship. Equal shares for all hands, extra for the man who spotted the prize, compensation from the common fund for injuries. Votes decided everything from who would captain to where the next cruise would head. Teach listened from the edge of these meetings, his tall frame easy to spot, but his voice rarely heard. The men respected the silence. It marked him as someone who thought before acting. His own daily habits settled into the pattern of the place. He rose with the first light, checked the sloop for any overnight damage, and spent an hour cleaning and loading his pistols on a flat rock overlooking the water. The beard had grown unchecked during the Florida months, and now hung thick and dark to his chest. He combed it with a piece of bone each morning and tied it back with a length of yarn when working. The nickname Blackbeard began to circulate in casual talk around the fires, not as a title he claimed, but as a simple description that everyone understood. He did not correct it. In the afternoons he walked the harbour, noting which vessels looked fast and which captains kept their crews in good order. Evenings he sat quietly with a small group that included a few faces from the old Hornigold days, exchanging news of recent arrivals and the prices being paid for captured goods in distant ports. Political forces that once shaped Bristol and the wartime Caribbean had simply vanished here. London was too far away and too busy with its own affairs to send ships or officials. The Spanish kept to their main trade routes, unwilling to risk men on a distant island that offered little profit. The French had their hands full with their own plantations. This left the harbour and the surrounding quays under the practical control of the men who lived there. They posted lookouts on the high ground to watch for sails, and any suspicious vessel was met by armed boats before it could enter. The system worked without formal government. It relied on shared interest and the knowledge that betrayal meant being cut off from the only safe place in the region. Clothing reflected the practical needs of constant sun and salt water. Most men wore loose canvas trousers cut off at the knee, checked shirts faded to grey, and wide-brimmed hats woven from palm leaves. Shoes were rare. Bare feet gripped the sand and the deck better. Teach kept 2 good shirts and a pair of breeches for special occasions, but everyday wear was the same simple kit as everyone else. Women in the settlement, perhaps 24 in total, ran small stalls selling mended sails, fresh bread, and occasional luxuries like needles or thread brought by traders. They moved freely and were treated with the same rough courtesy extended to any useful member of the community. As the weeks passed, Teach's role in Nassau grew, without any deliberate effort on his part. He helped careen 3 different sloops, earning shares of small stores in return. When a fever swept through one crew after a trip to the Mosquito Coast, he carried water and broth to the sick men without being asked. His size and steady manner made him useful in settling minor disputes. A single word from him often ended an argument before fists were raised. The silver from Florida lasted longer than most men's money because he spent it carefully on powder, shot, and a new set of sails for his sloop, rather than on rum or dice. He began to see how the community sustained itself through these small exchanges, each man contributing what he could and taking only what he needed to keep sailing. By early 1716, the harbour had become a genuine base for more organised activity. New ships arrived almost weekly, some captured outright, others simply sailed in by crews tired of merchant wages. Teach watched as Benjamin Hornigold returned from a cruise with 2 prizes and a crew that looked well-fed and confident. The 2 men met again on the beach one evening, recognising each other immediately from the old privateering days. Hornigold had aged little. His eyes still carried the same calculating look. They spoke briefly about the changed times and the opportunities the current situation offered. No grand promises were made, but the conversation ended with an understanding that they might sail together again if the right target appeared. The inner life Teach had carried since Bristol now found its place in this new setting. He no longer worried about wages or owners waiting in England. The fear of the press gang was gone. In its place sat a calm acceptance of the risks that came with every voyage, and a quiet satisfaction in knowing that every decision rested with the men who would live or die by it. He kept his small notebook of charts and notes, adding sketches of the Bahama Cays and the currents between them. His ambitions remained private, but they had sharpened. A fast ship, a reliable crew, and the freedom to choose when and where to sail. The settlement continued its steady growth around him. More huts went up, more fires burned at night, more sails appeared on the horizon. The culture that developed was one of practical democracy at sea and rough equality on land. Men who had been pressed into naval service or beaten by merchant captains found a different order here. They voted on their leaders, shared their prizes, and answered to no king or parliament. Teach saw how this arrangement kept the community alive, despite the constant threat of Spanish raids or British interference that might one day come. For now, the lawless islands offered exactly what the men needed: a place to repair, to plan, and to live on their own terms. He spent one quiet afternoon sitting on the bow of his sloop, watching the sun set behind the low hills of New Providence. The harbour was full, the beach alive with movement, and the sound of laughter mixed with the creak of rigging drifted across the water. The decision he had felt pulling at him after the Florida trip had now taken solid form. The next chapter would begin here, among these men, under these skies, in the only place in the Atlantic where a former merchant sailor could become something the world had never seen before. Hornigold's crew. The decision came one morning when the sun had just cleared the low hills behind Nassau. Edward Teach walked down to the water's edge where Benjamin Hornigold's sloop lay at anchor and signalled his intention to join the crew. Hornigold accepted him without question. The two men had sailed together during the war years, and Teach's reputation for steadiness had travelled with him through the Florida salvage work. Within an hour, he had moved his few possessions aboard and taken his place among the 42 men who formed the company. The vessel was a fast sloop of about 80 tons, recently careened and fitted with 10 carriage guns. She carried the name Ranger, though names changed often in those waters. Life aboard began immediately with the familiar shipboard routine that Teach knew well from his privateering days, yet with important differences. No royal commission hung over them now. Every action they took would be on their own account and at their own risk. The articles were read out once again on deck, the same simple rules that had governed the community ashore. Equal shares after the captain took his two, compensation for injuries from the common chest, no fighting aboard ship, and decisions made by vote when the company was assembled. Hornigold explained the terms quietly, and every man signed or made his mark. Teach was assigned to the gun crew on the larboard side and given a watch at the helm when needed. The sloop carried a mixed company, some from the old Bristol privateers, others who had arrived more recently from Jamaica or the Carolinas. They spoke little of their pasts. What mattered was how a man handled the lines in a squall or kept his head when the guns spoke. Hornigold himself was a steady captain in his late 30s, with a calm voice and a habit of chewing tobacco while studying the horizon. He preferred to target French and Spanish vessels when possible, avoiding English ships unless the company voted otherwise. This preference came from his own background and kept relations with passing traders from the colonies somewhat easier. The first cruise took them westward along the Bahama banks in the late spring of 1716. They sailed in company with 2 other sloops that had joined for the venture, forming a small squadron that could cover more sea room. Provisions were basic: salt pork, peas, cassava bread baked ashore, and water casked fresh from the springs. Rum was issued sparingly, half a pint a day when the sun grew hot. Clothing stayed practical loose trousers, shirts that had seen many washings in seawater, and broad hats against the glare. Teach kept his beard tied back during work, but let it hang free in the evenings, a habit that drew occasional comments around the cook's fire without ever becoming a topic of conversation. Days followed a steady pattern. The morning watch cleaned the deck and checked the guns. Lookouts scanned the horizon from the masthead, calling down when sails appeared. When a target was sighted, the company assembled to vote on pursuit. On one occasion, a small French trader bound for Martinique came into view. The vote was unanimous. The sloops closed in under full sail, fired a warning shot, and the merchant struck without resistance. Teach boarded with the prize crew, inventorying the hold, barrels of wine, bolts of cloth, and a small chest of coins. The French captain handed over his papers without argument and was allowed to keep enough stores for his crew to reach the nearest port. The cargo was divided later according to the articles, each man receiving his portion in silver or goods that could be traded in Nassau. Hornigold kept the operations efficient. He avoided unnecessary violence, knowing that a reputation for fairness sometimes brought voluntary surrenders. Teach observed how the captain managed the company, listening to suggestions during meetings, enforcing the rules evenly, and sharing every decision that affected the whole crew. The political reality of the time supported this approach. With no governor in the Bahamas and the Royal Navy occupied elsewhere, the waters around New Providence offered a safe operating area. Spanish patrols stayed closer to their own coasts, and English authorities in Jamaica had too few ships to reach the outer islands regularly. This vacuum allowed the squadron to move freely, choosing targets along the trade routes that funneled through the Florida Straits and the Windward Passage. Between cruises, the sloops returned to Nassau for careening and resupply. The harbour had grown even busier during their absence. New arrivals brought news from the mainland, rumours of pardons being discussed in London, reports of Spanish guardacostas strengthening their patrols, and occasional letters from families in England or the colonies. Teach spent his time ashore repairing his gear and listening to these exchanges. He developed the practice of walking the beach at low tide, noting the condition of stranded hulls and calculating what repairs would be needed for the next voyage. His share from the first prize allowed him to buy better powder and a new set of pistols from a Bermudan trader who visited regularly. By midsummer, the squadron had taken 4 more vessels. One was a Spanish coaster carrying hides and logwood, another a French snow loaded with sugar. Each capture followed the same measured process: approach, surrender, boarding, division. Teach's role expanded quietly. Hornigold began sending him with small boarding parties, trusting his judgment in assessing cargo value and crew willingness to join. On one cruise, Teach was given temporary command of a captured sloop to act as tender, sailing in company and handling the navigation while Hornigold led from the Ranger. The experience taught him the difference between following orders and making the small daily decisions that kept a vessel moving. The crew's inner dynamics reflected the articles they lived by. Disputes over shares were settled by vote rather than force. Injured men received their compensation promptly, and those who fell ill were cared for by the company until they recovered. Teach noted how this system kept morale steady even during long weeks without a sighting. Meals were shared from the common pot turtle stew when fresh meat was available, boiled salt beef otherwise. Evenings brought quiet talk around the deck, men mending clothes or cleaning weapons while the watch changed. No one pressed Teach for stories of his Bristol days. Privacy was respected as long as a man did his work. Hornigold's leadership shaped the early pattern of operations. He avoided attacking British vessels when he could, believing it preserved a fragile balance with colonial traders who sometimes supplied the settlement. The company respected this stance even when votes occasionally went against it. Teach absorbed the lesson. Restraint in certain matters could extend their time at sea. The wider forces at play remained distant. London continued to ignore the Bahamas, focused instead on European affairs and the costs of maintaining distant colonies. Spain protested the raids, but lacked the naval strength to act decisively so far north. France watched its own trade suffer but offered no coordinated response. This neglect turned the waters around Nassau into a practical zone of self-government, where the only law was the one the men wrote for themselves. As autumn approached, Teach's standing within the crew had risen. Hornigold placed him in formal command of a captured sloop of 6 guns, giving him his own small company of 20 hands while still sailing in consort. The arrangement suited both men. Teach handled the navigation and boarding details on his vessel, reporting back each evening under the stars. The 2 sloops cruised together through the quays, taking occasional prizes and returning to Nassau with holds that kept the settlement supplied. Teach's habits aboard his own command mirrored what he had observed: steady watches, fair division of stores, and quiet enforcement of the articles. His beard had grown fuller still, and the men under him referred to him simply as Teach, or sometimes by the emerging description that followed his appearance. The winter months of 1716, 1717 brought shorter cruises because of the northerly gales that swept the banks. The squadron stayed closer to home, focusing on smaller targets and using the protected anchorages among the islands. Provisions grew leaner, more reliance on fish and cassava, less on captured livestock. Yet the company held together. Teach spent the idle weeks careening both vessels, scraping bottoms and replacing worn rigging. He kept his notebook updated with sketches of new channels and anchorages, adding details that might prove useful later. His ambitions remained private, focused on mastering the practical side of command rather than any larger vision. By early 1717, the partnership had produced a steady record of captures without major losses. The men who sailed with Hornigold and Teach understood the value of the arrangement, shared risk, shared reward, and the freedom that came from operating beyond reach of distant authorities. Teach had moved from deckhand to commander of his own sloop in less than a year. The change felt natural, built on the skills he had gathered since Bristol and the opportunities the lawless islands provided. Hornigold continued to lead the larger decisions, but the two captains consulted regularly, dividing responsibilities according to the needs of each cruise. The early days of organised piracy in the region had taken solid form around them. Nassau served as the central base, the sloops as the instruments, and the articles as the framework that held everything together. Teach observed it all with the same quiet attention he had given to merchant service years earlier. The life suited him. The sea, the company of capable men, the direct connection between effort and reward. Political forces that once dictated privateering commissions had been replaced by something simpler and more immediate. Here the only authority was the one the crews granted one another. The partnership would continue for several more months, carrying them farther afield and into new waters. For now the routine held: sail, watch, vote, act, divide, return. Edward Teach, standing at the helm of his sloop one clear morning as the trade wind filled the sails, felt the steady progress of the life he had chosen. The years ahead would build directly on these foundations, rising in rank. The partnership continued through the spring of 1717, with the two sloops operating in close company along the edges of the Bahama Banks and into the Florida Straits. Edward Teach had now commanded his own vessel for several months, and Hornigold began to delegate more responsibility during joint operations. When a target appeared on the horizon, the captains would meet briefly by boat to agree on tactics, but the actual execution fell increasingly to Teach on his sloop. The men under him noticed the change. He assigned watches with the same steady routine they had known under Hornigold, yet he allowed small suggestions during company meetings and made sure every share was tallied openly before division. This approach earned quiet approval. No man felt shortchanged, and the crew remained loyal without the need for harsh discipline. The raids themselves grew more methodical. In late April they sighted a Spanish merchantman bound from Havana to Cadiz, carrying hides, cochineal, and a modest chest of silver. Teach led the boarding party from his sloop, while Hornigold covered from a distance. He directed his men to secure the deck first, then the hold, without unnecessary damage to the vessel. The Spanish captain surrendered after a single warning shot, and the cargo was transferred efficiently. Back in Nassau the division followed the articles exactly. Each hand received his portion, with extra for the lookouts who had first spotted the sails. Teach kept his own share modest, using part of it to buy fresh powder and new cordage for both sloops. The success reinforced his growing reputation as someone who could be trusted to lead without waste or risk to the company. Daily life on these extended cruises followed the same practical patterns that had sustained the settlement. The men rose at first light to pump the bilges and check the rigging. Meals came from the common stores: boiled salt beef or fresh fish when they could catch it, cassava bread baked in iron pans on deck, and water measured out carefully to last until the next watering stop. Rum was issued once a day, watered down to prevent overindulgence. Clothing stayed simple and durable: canvas trousers rolled to the knee, faded shirts, and wide hats woven from local palm. Teach maintained his own habits without fanfare. He cleaned his pistols every morning on the quarterdeck, oiled the mechanisms, and checked the flints. His beard, now reaching well below his chest, was combed and tied back with yarn during work, but left loose when the ship was at anchor. The men began to notice how the beard altered his appearance in certain light, giving him a presence that required no raised voice to command attention. Hornigold's trust deepened over the summer months. He allowed Teach to lead independent forays with his sloop, while the Ranger remained at a rendezvous point. On one such cruise, Teach took a French sugar ship off the Windward Passage. The vessel carried not only cargo but also a handful of passengers bound for Martinique. Teach treated them with the same calm efficiency he applied to the crew. Provisions were left for their continued voyage, and the ship was released after the hold was cleared. When he returned to the squadron, the company voted to increase his share slightly for the successful solo action. This marked a shift in his standing. He was no longer simply a reliable subordinate. He had begun to shape the way raids were conducted, favouring quick surrenders over prolonged fights and making sure captured crews could reach safety afterward. The political situation in the region remained unchanged. London still sent no ships to enforce order in the Bahamas, and the Spanish focused their limited naval strength closer to their main trade routes. French authorities in Martinique complained to their governor, but no coordinated response reached the outer islands. This vacuum allowed Teach and Hornigold to extend their operations farther north along the Carolina coast by late summer. They avoided major colonial ports, targeting smaller traders and coasters that carried useful supplies back to Nassau. Each return trip brought fresh stores, barrels of flour, salt, and occasional livestock that kept the settlement fed and the ships ready for sea. Teach's inner calculations during these months turned toward longer-term stability for the company. He began to keep more detailed notes in his small notebook, sketches of anchorages, records of currents, and lists of supplies that lasted best on extended cruises. His fears had narrowed to practical matters: spoiled water, sudden gales, or a stray Spanish patrol rather than the broader uncertainties of earlier years. He developed the habit of walking the deck alone at night when the watch changed, studying the stars for navigation checks and considering how the articles could be refined for larger crews. Ambition remained private, focused on building a reliable group of men who followed because the system worked, not because of force. The crew around him reflected the same steady development. Several men who had joined from Jamaica proved skilled at gunnery and were placed in charge of specific guns under Teach's direction. Others handled the small boats used for boarding, learning to approach silently and secure lines quickly. Daily interactions stayed practical. When a man injured his hand during a gun exercise, the company voted compensation from the chest without delay. When stores ran low on one cruise, the hands agreed to shorten rations equally rather than argue over portions. Teach observed these moments and adjusted his own decisions accordingly, ensuring that leadership felt shared even as his role grew. By autumn 1717, the partnership had taken more than a dozen prizes since the beginning of the year. Teach's sloop had become the faster and more manoeuvrable of the two, and Hornigold increasingly let him choose the course when they separated for short periods. The reputation that travelled back to Nassau described a tall captain with a distinctive beard who commanded without shouting and delivered consistent results. Men who had been considering other captains began to seek places on Teach's vessel. He accepted only a few, choosing those who understood the articles and could handle both sail and gun without complaint. The additions strengthened the company without altering its balance. Clothing and personal gear reflected the life at sea. Teach replaced his shirts twice during the year, buying plain linen from captured goods and cutting them to fit his large frame. His pistols stayed at his belt even when the ship was at rest, a habit that others copied for readiness. Food improved slightly with the capture of a fishing smack carrying smoked fish and fresh fruit from the islands. The men ate together on deck when weather permitted, passing the common pot and discussing the next possible target in quiet tones. No grand plans were voiced. The talk stayed on practical matters: wind direction, likely routes, and the condition of the hull. The wider forces shaping their world remained distant, yet influential. The British government in London had begun to discuss the problem of the Bahama pirates in general terms, but no immediate action followed. Colonial governors in Virginia and the Carolinas complained about disrupted trade, yet their own resources were limited. Spain continued to protest the losses, but kept its warships closer to the treasure routes. This combination of neglect and scattered authority gave Teach room to develop his approach. He focused on targets that carried useful goods rather than those that might provoke stronger retaliation, and he made sure captured crews spread the word that resistance was pointless, but fair treatment was guaranteed. As winter approached, Teach's standing within the broader community of Nassau had risen noticeably. When the sloops returned for careening, men gathered to hear accounts of the cruises, and his name appeared more often in the quiet conversations around the fires. He continued to live simply ashore, repairing his own gear and sharing rum only when the company celebrated a successful division. His beard had become a practical feature as well as a mark of identity. It protected against the sun and spray, and he trimmed it only enough to keep it manageable. The habit of steady observation that had begun in Bristol now served him in command. He noted how men behaved under pressure, which sails held best in a blow, and which provisions lasted longest. The year 1717 drew to a close, with the partnership intact, and Teach firmly established as a captain in his own right. He had earned the trust of both Hornigold and the men through consistent results and fair leadership. His own approach to raids, quick, efficient, and sparing of unnecessary violence, had begun to set a pattern that others noticed. The life suited his temperament. The sea provided the freedom he had sought since leaving merchant service, and the company gave structure without the rigid hierarchies of naval or colonial authority. Political forces that once dictated every move now existed only as background conditions to be navigated rather than obeyed. The next phase of operations would carry them even farther from Nassau and into waters where new opportunities and new risks waited. For Edward Teach, the progress felt measured and deliberate, built on the foundations of every previous year at sea. He stood ready to meet whatever came next with the same quiet competence that had brought him this far. Queen Anne's revenge it. The new year of 1718 opened with the trade winds steady and the harbour at Nassau unusually quiet after the winter storms. Edward Teach and Benjamin Hornigold fitted out their 2 sloops for a longer cruise, stocking extra powder, shot and provisions that would let them stay at sea for weeks without returning. The company numbered about 120 men divided between the vessels, with Teach's sloop carrying the faster lines and the larger share of experienced hands. They cleared the islands on the morning tide of the 3rd week in January and shaped a course southeast toward the Windward Passage, where the French trade from Martinique and Guadeloupe crossed the main Atlantic routes. For 9 days they saw nothing larger than fishing boats. The routine aboard both sloops remained unchanged. Morning gun drills, constant lookout duty from the mastheads, and careful rationing of water drawn from the last cask. Teach stood his watches at the helm of his own vessel, feeling the wheel respond under his hands as the sloop lifted to each swell. His beard, now a thick black mass that reached the middle of his chest, was tied back with a strip of red cloth during the day. At night, he let it hang loose while he checked the compass and noted the ship's progress on the slate. The men had grown accustomed to his quiet presence. When he gave an order, it was spoken once, in the same even tone he had used since Bristol, and the work was done without hesitation. On the 10th day, a lookout called down from the maintop. A large 3-masted ship had appeared on the southern horizon, running before the wind with all plain sail set. The vessel was clearly French, her hull painted in the pale yellow favoured by merchants out of Nantes. Hornigold and Teach met briefly by boat between the 2 sloops and agreed on the approach. No vote was needed. The target was too rich to ignore. They spread out to cut off any escape and closed steadily. The Frenchman, later identified as La Concorde, carried 14 guns but made no attempt to fight. Her captain struck his colours after the first warning shot passed close across her bow. Teach led the boarding party himself, climbing the side with a pistol in his belt and a cutlass at his hip. The deck of La Concorde felt solid under his feet after months on the lighter sloops. She measured 250 tons, broad in the beam, with a deep hold that still smelled faintly of the slave cargo she had carried from Guinea to Martinique the previous autumn. Her current lading consisted of sugar hogsheads, indigo, and a quantity of gold dust and coin paid for the human cargo. The French captain, a thin man named Pierre Dosset, handed over his papers without protest and asked only that his crew be allowed enough stores to reach the nearest island. Teach agreed at once. The articles had always favoured quick, clean captures. Hornigold came aboard shortly afterward. The 2 captains walked the length of the prize together, noting the strong timbers, the well-laid deck planking, and the roomy great cabin aft. La Concorde was in good repair, recently careened in Martinique, and her sailing qualities were excellent for a vessel of her size. Hornigold studied the ship for several minutes in silence, then turned to Teach and said simply that this was the vessel they had been waiting for. The company assembled on the main deck of the prize. A vote was taken. Teach would take command of the new ship, transfer his own crew across, and the smaller sloop would remain with Hornigold. The decision passed without a single dissenting voice. 40 men from the combined companies chose to join Teach immediately, drawn by the size of the prize and the promise of larger shares in future captures. Work began at once. The new flagship was renamed Queen Anne's Revenge in a short ceremony on the quarterdeck, the name chosen because the war that had trained them all still lingered in memory, and because the Queen herself had died only 3 years earlier. Guns were shifted from the sloops, 6 more carriage pieces mounted on the upper deck, bringing the total to 20. Powder and shot were redistributed evenly. Teach supervised the transfer of stores himself, making certain that every cask of water and barrel of salt beef was stowed securely. The French crew was set ashore on a nearby quay with their boat and enough provisions for 10 days. They left without complaint. The first days aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge felt different from anything Teach had known. The deck was wider, the quarters less cramped, and the ship rode the swells with a deeper, steadier motion. He established the same watch system he had used on his sloop, but now with room for a larger gun crew and a dedicated sailmaker who could repair damage while underway. Meals continued from the common pot, though the cook now had a larger galley and could prepare stews with the fresh vegetables taken from the Frenchman's stores. Clothing remained practical. Teach kept 2 new linen shirts from the prize and cut them to fit his frame, rolling the sleeves above the elbows when working the guns. Hornigold's sloop stayed in company for another week while they cruised together through the passage. They took 2 smaller French traders during that time, adding more guns and stores to the Revenge. Teach began to feel the full weight of command on a vessel this size. He walked the decks each evening after the watch changed, checking lashings and speaking quietly with the men on lookout. His fears had narrowed to the practical, keeping the hull sound in heavy weather, maintaining discipline without the need for punishment, and ensuring the powder remained dry. In the great cabin he kept his notebook open on the table, adding new entries about the ship's trim and the way she handled under different sail combinations. By mid-February, the partnership reached a natural end. Hornigold announced he would return to Nassau with his sloop and a small prize they had taken. He wished Teach well, and left 20 additional men who chose to stay with the larger ship. The separation was amicable. The 2 captains shook hands on the quarterdeck of the Revenge and parted without ceremony. Teach now commanded a vessel that could stand up to any merchantman in the Caribbean, and most naval sloops as well. He shaped a course northward, intending to cruise the Carolina coast where the trade was rich and the naval presence thin. Life aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge settled into its own rhythm. The larger crew required more organisation, yet the articles remained the same. Each man received 1 full share, the captain 2, and the company voted on major decisions. Teach kept the daily routine simple: gun exercise every morning, sail handling in the afternoon, and careful navigation by dead reckoning checked against the sun at noon. Food improved with the capture of fishing vessels that supplied fresh snapper and turtles. Rum was still issued once a day, but Teach limited the amount to keep the men alert. His own habits stayed unchanged. He continued to clean his pistols each dawn, combed his beard with a bone comb, and tied it back with the same red yarn when the wind freshened. The men who had chosen to sail with him formed a capable company. Several had served on men of war and knew the handling of heavy guns. Others were carpenters and sailmakers who kept the ship in repair without constant orders. They spoke of Teach with respect in the forecastle, noting how he never raised his voice yet expected every task completed promptly. The nickname Blackbeard, first heard in Nassau, now travelled with the ship. No one used it to his face, but the description fit the man who stood on the quarterdeck with his dark beard flowing in the breeze and his pistols crossed in his belt. Political conditions continued to favour their operations. The governor of the Bahamas remained absent, and the Royal Navy had no frigates stationed in the outer islands. Spanish protests reached Madrid but produced no immediate ships. Colonial authorities in Charlestown and Williamsburg complained about losses, yet their own patrol vessels were too few to cover the long coastline. Teach understood these realities and used them. He avoided major ports, stayed close to the shallow banks where larger warships could not follow, and made sure captured crews carried word that resistance brought damage, while surrender brought fair treatment. By March, the Queen Anne's Revenge had taken 5 more prizes along the Carolina coast. Each capture added to the stores and the company's confidence. Teach kept careful accounts in his notebook, noting the value of each cargo and the exact division of shares. His inner life had grown quieter still. The ambitions that had begun in Bristol now had a clear shape. A powerful ship under his command, a loyal company that followed the articles, and the freedom to sail where opportunity led. He no longer wondered about returning to merchant service. That life belonged to the past. The flagship rode at anchor one calm evening in a protected sound south of the Carolina Capes. The crew mended sails on deck while the sun dropped behind the low islands. Teach stood alone at the stern rail, looking out across the water. The Queen Anne's Revenge creaked gently at her cables, her new guns gleaming under the last light. The vessel had become exactly what he had needed, large enough to dominate the trade routes, fast enough to escape pursuit, and strong enough to carry the life he had chosen. The next months would test that strength, but for now, the ship felt solid beneath his feet, and the future stretched open before him. Crafting the legend, the Queen Anne's Revenge continued northward along the Carolina coast through the early spring of 1718. Edward Teach kept the ship well offshore during daylight hours, using the shallow banks and inlets to avoid any passing naval patrols. The larger hull allowed for longer cruises without frequent returns to Nassau, and the company grew accustomed to the steady motion of the three-master. Provisions held well sugar and indigo from the French prize, mixed with captured salt pork and fresh fish caught from the deck. Water remained the limiting factor. Teach ordered careful rationing and frequent checks of the casks to prevent spoilage in the warming weather. Teach began to adjust his personal appearance in small but deliberate ways during these weeks. He let his beard grow unchecked, no longer trimming it to the short length he had maintained in merchant service or early privateering. The black hair reached his waist when loose, thick and coarse from constant exposure to salt and sun. He started the practice of twisting slow matches lengths of hemp cord soaked in saltpetre into the strands before going into action. The fuses were lit just before an approach, burning slowly with a faint smoke that drifted around his face. The effect was immediate and practical. The glowing embers made his features appear larger and more menacing in the half-light of dawn or dusk, when most captures took place. Men on the opposing deck saw a tall figure wreathed in smoke, pistols crossed in his belt, and often struck their colours before the first broadside landed. The slow matches were not mere show. Teach carried several in a small pouch at his waist, ready to light from a linstock kept near the quarterdeck guns. The practice served a dual purpose. It created an intimidating presence that encouraged surrender without fighting, and it kept the fuses close at hand if boarding turned into close combat. He tested the method first on a small coaster taken off the outer banks. The merchant captain later reported seeing a devil with fire in his beard standing on the rail of the Revenge, and the story spread quickly among coastal traders. Teach did not encourage the tales, but he did not discourage them either. The reputation saved powder and lives. Daily life aboard the flagship remained organised under the same articles that had governed smaller vessels. The larger crew, now nearing 300 when counting those who had joined from recent prizes, required more structure. Teach divided the men into watches that rotated every 4 hours, with gun crews assigned permanent stations. Morning brought the usual routine: deck washing, gun exercise, and sail checks. The cook prepared meals in the expanded galley stewed turtle when they could catch it, boiled beef otherwise, and hard bread softened in water. Rum continued to be issued once daily, measured carefully to maintain discipline. Teach walked the decks each evening after supper, speaking briefly with the men on watch and checking the set of the sails. His orders were given quietly, and the work was completed promptly. The company around him adapted to the new routines without complaint. Several gunners who had served on men of war took charge of the heavier pieces, training the newer hands in loading and aiming. Carpenters kept the hull tight, replacing caulking where needed after long passages. The men respected Teach's steady manner. When a dispute arose over the division of a small prize, he called the company together on the main deck and read the articles aloud, then let the vote decide. The process ended the argument cleanly. No flogging or punishment was ever required. The shared interest in maintaining the system proved sufficient. Teach's habits during these months reflected the same practicality he had always shown. He kept his pistols oiled and loaded, cleaning them each morning on the quarterdeck where the light was best. His clothing stayed simple, loose trousers, a checked shirt, and a wide hat against the sun, but he added a bandolier across his chest that held extra powder horns and shot. The beard required daily attention. He combed it with a bone comb to remove salt crystals and tied it back when handling ropes or guns. At night, he let it hang free, the slow matches tucked safely away until needed. The appearance served its purpose without becoming theatrical. It was a tool, like the cutlass at his side or the compass in his pocket. The intimidation factor proved effective on several occasions. In April, they approached a Virginia tobacco ship bound for England. Teach lit the fuses before the final approach, standing at the rail with smoke curling around his face. The merchant captain ordered his colours struck before the Revenge had fired a gun. The cargo hogsheads of leaf tobacco was valuable in Nassau, where it could be traded for rum and stores. Teach allowed the captain and crew to keep their personal effects and enough provisions for the return voyage. Word of the encounter reached Charlestown within days, carried by the released crew. Traders began to speak of Blackbeard as a captain who fought only when forced, yet whose appearance alone could end a chase. Teach did not seek out the name, but it attached itself firmly. In Nassau, the stories grew with each return voyage. Men who had sailed with him described the burning fuses and the tall figure who never shouted an order. The descriptions spread along the coast, carried by released prisoners and by traders who had seen the Revenge from a distance. Teach remained indifferent to the growing legend. His focus stayed on the practical, keeping the ship supplied, the crew fed, and the captures clean. He continued to avoid unnecessary violence, knowing that a reputation for mercy encouraged surrenders and reduced the risk of retaliation. Political forces in the colonies began to stir in response to the increasing activity. Governors in Virginia and the Carolinas wrote to London complaining of losses to the pirates of New Providence. The Board of Trade discussed the matter in dispatches, but no immediate squadron was dispatched. The Royal Navy remained stretched thin after the war, with ships committed to Mediterranean patrols and West Indian convoys. This delay gave Teach room to operate. He kept the Revenge moving, never staying in one area long enough for a coordinated pursuit to form. The ship's size allowed her to outrun most sloops of war, and her shallow draft let her escape into inlets where deeper vessels could not follow. By late spring, the crew had grown confident in the new routines. They exercised the guns daily, practicing broadsides against floating targets made from empty barrels. Teach joined the drills himself, helping train the newer hands in sponging and ramming. His presence at the guns added weight to the lessons. Men watched how he handled the linstock and judged the roll before firing. The ship's armament had increased to 40 guns through captures and transfers, making her one of the most powerful vessels in American waters outside the Navy. Teach kept careful records of powder consumption and shot expenditure, ensuring the magazine stayed well stocked. The inner life Teach carried remained private, even amid the larger company. He spent quiet hours in the great cabin studying charts and noting wind patterns. His notebook now included sketches of coastal inlets along the Carolinas, with soundings and hazards marked. Ambition had taken concrete form. Maintain the ship, sustain the crew, and continue operations that kept everyone supplied without drawing overwhelming force against them. Fears had become manageable, storms could be ridden out, shortages could be managed through careful rationing, and pursuit could be evaded with knowledge of the banks. The legend that grew around him served as a shield, reducing the need for actual combat. In June, they took a merchant brig off Ocracoke Inlet, carrying rum and molasses from Barbados. Teach again lit the fuses before closing, standing visible on the quarterdeck with smoke drifting upward. The brig surrendered immediately. The cargo proved useful. The rum was divided among the men, and the molasses went into the stores for distilling ashore. Released crew carried the story northward, adding details about the pirate with fire in his beard who commanded a great ship. The accounts reached officials in Williamsburg and Charlestown, where they were recorded in letters to London. Teach's leadership during these months remained consistent. He consulted the company on major decisions, course changes, pursuit of distant sails, division of larger prizes, yet handled daily operations with minimal discussion. The men followed because the system worked. Shares arrived promptly, injuries were compensated, and the ship stayed ready for sea. His appearance, now complete with the burning fuses, had become part of the practical toolkit of command. It saved lives on both sides by ending fights before they began. The Queen Anne's Revenge sailed on through the summer, her captain tall and quiet at the helm, his beard wreathed in smoke when action neared. The legend had taken root, spread by released prisoners, and whispered in taverns from Boston to Bridgetown. Teach used it without embracing it, keeping his focus on the sea, the ship, and the men who sailed her. The life he had built since leaving Bristol now existed in full form. A powerful vessel, a disciplined company, and a reputation that cleared the path ahead. Pirate code life, the Queen Anne's Revenge spent the summer of 1718 cruising the waters between the Carolina Capes and the northern Bahamas, rarely venturing far from the shelter of the Outer Banks. Edward Teach kept the ship on a loose patrol pattern that allowed frequent returns to inlets where fresh water could be taken and the hull inspected. The larger company required careful management of stores, and Teach made it a point to check the hold every few days himself, tallying barrels of beef, peas, and rum against the daily consumption. The articles remained the guiding document for every aspect of shipboard existence, read aloud whenever a new man joined, and referred to whenever a question arose. Daily division of labour followed a fixed schedule that kept the vessel in constant readiness. The morning watch began at 4 bells, with the pump crew clearing the bilges while the cook kindled the galley fire. By sunrise the deck was scrubbed, hammocks lashed, and the guns wiped down with fresh oil. Teach walked the length of the ship during this hour, noting any loose seizing on the rigging or signs of rot in the planking. His presence was enough to keep the work moving. He rarely needed to speak beyond pointing out a specific task. Breakfast followed oatmeal boiled with salt pork scraps when supplies allowed, or hard bread soaked in water otherwise. Each man received the same portion, measured from the common pot under the eye of the quartermaster. The articles governed food and drink with precision. No man was permitted to hoard provisions for himself. All captures were brought to the main deck for inventory before division, and the quartermaster kept the accounts in a ledger that any hand could inspect. Rum was issued once daily, half a pint per man, watered according to the vote of the company when stores ran low. On days without action, the men were allowed small games of dice or cards in the forecastle, but gambling with ship's stores was forbidden. Disputes over debts were settled ashore or deferred until the next prize. No man could be forced to pay aboard. Teach enforced these rules evenly. When one sailor attempted to hide a bottle of captured brandy, Teach had the man bring it forward publicly, then poured the contents into the common rum barrel, so everyone shared the addition. Injuries and illness fell under the same system. The articles set fixed compensation: 600 pieces of 8 for the loss of a right arm, 500 for a left, 400 for a leg, and lesser amounts for fingers or eyes. These sums came from the common chest before any division of prize money. Teach kept the chest locked in the great cabin with 2 keys, one held by him, the other by the quartermaster. When a gunner lost 2 fingers to a recoiling piece during practice, the company voted the compensation immediately, and the man received his coins from the chest that same evening. Sick men were moved to the forecastle, where they received the best available food and water until they recovered, or in rare cases, died. Teach visited the sick daily, checking their condition and making sure the cook prepared broth when meat was short. The crew's composition reflected the mixed origins of the pirate community. Men from England, Scotland, Ireland and the colonies formed the majority, with a handful from France, Holland and even a few former slaves who had joined from captured vessels. No distinction was made in shares or duties based on origin. A man's place depended on his skill with sail, gun or rope. Teach assigned positions according to ability. Experienced gunners manned the heavier pieces, carpenters worked under the boatswain, and the youngest hands learned from the older ones during quiet watches. Conversations in the forecastle turned often to practical matters. The set of a sail, the taste of fresh turtle compared to salt beef, the best way to splice a line under strain. Stories of past captures were told without exaggeration, simply as lessons in what had worked and what had not. Teach maintained his own routines amid the larger group. He rose before the watch changed, cleaned his pistols on the quarterdeck, and checked the slow matches in his pouch. The beard required daily combing to prevent matting from salt spray. He performed the task methodically, using the same bone comb he had carried since Nassau. When action neared, he twisted fresh fuses into the strands and lit them from a linstock, a preparation that had become standard procedure. The crew accepted the ritual as part of the ship's routine, no different from loading the guns or wetting the sails before a squall. His clothing stayed functional. Loose trousers rolled above the ankle, a linen shirt that had once been white, and a wide hat that shaded his face during the midday sun. Decision-making aboard followed the articles closely. When a sail appeared on the horizon, the company assembled on the main deck. Teach explained the sighting, the wind direction, and the estimated course of the target. Votes were taken by show of hands. Pursue or stand off, attack under colours or approach quietly. Once the decision was made, execution fell to the officers and crew. Teach rarely overruled a vote unless it endangered the ship directly. On one occasion, the company voted to chase a distant brigantine despite failing light. Teach allowed the pursuit, but ordered reduced sail to avoid grounding on the banks. The chase was abandoned when darkness fell, and no resentment followed because the reasoning had been clear. Loot sharing happened immediately after each capture. Goods were brought to the deck, inventoried by the quartermaster, and divided equally after the captain's and ship's shares were set aside. Coins were counted into small bags, one per man, while bulk goods like sugar or cloth were apportioned by lot or agreement. Teach took his 2 shares openly and stored them in the great cabin until the next return to Nassau. No man questioned the process. The transparency kept trust intact. When a captured vessel carried personal items, watches, buckles, clothing, these were left with their owners, unless the company voted otherwise for particularly valuable pieces. The wider social forces shaping their existence remained distant. London's discussions about suppressing the New Providence pirates had not yet translated into ships or troops. Colonial governors issued proclamations warning against joining the pirates, but the proclamations rarely reached the outer islands. In Nassau, the settlement continued to grow, sustained by the goods the Revenge and other vessels brought in. Returning crews spent their shares quickly on rum, fresh food, repairs, and occasional visits from traders who arrived with cloth, tools and news from the mainland. Teach kept his own expenditures minimal, preferring to invest in the ship's maintenance and the common chest. Evenings aboard brought a measure of quiet. The watch on deck kept lookout, while the off-watch men mended clothes, sharpened blades, or simply sat in small groups talking low. Music came occasionally, a fiddle played softly, or a man singing an old four-bitter in the waist. Teach rarely joined these gatherings. He preferred the quarterdeck rail after dark, watching the phosphorescence trail behind the rudder and considering the next course. His notebook grew thicker with entries, soundings of hidden inlets, notes on how the Revenge handled under reduced sail, lists of stores that lasted longest in the heat. The code that governed their lives proved effective because it rested on mutual interest. Every man knew that breaking the articles meant expulsion or worse. yet enforcement came through the group rather than a single authority. Teach led by example, sharing the same rations, standing his watch, and handling the most dangerous tasks when boarding. The men followed because the system delivered consistent results: food in the hold, coins in their pockets, and a ship that stayed afloat and armed. By late summer, the Queen Anne's Revenge had become a self-contained society at sea. The articles provided the framework, the daily routine supplied the structure, and the shared risks created the cohesion. Teach stood at the centre of this arrangement, tall and quiet, his beard now a familiar sight to every hand aboard. He had shaped the life around the same principles he had learned in merchant service and refined in Nassau: fairness in division, readiness in action, and discipline without cruelty. The pirate code, in practice, proved as binding as any naval regulation, yet far more flexible and far more directly tied to the survival of every man who signed it. The ship sailed on through the warm waters, her company bound by rules they had chosen themselves. The life they led carried the same steady pulse as the waves beneath the keel, predictable in its routines, unpredictable in its outcomes, and sustained by the simple agreement that each man would keep his word to the others. Caribbean campaigns. The Queen Anne's Revenge turned southward again in the late summer of 1718, after a brief careening in a secluded Carolina Sound. Edward Teach chose the course to avoid the increasing coastal patrols that had begun to appear off Virginia and the Carolinas. The ship carried a full complement of provisions: fresh water from the last inlet, salt beef and peas from recent captures, and a quantity of rum that the company had voted to keep aboard, rather than divide immediately. The larger vessel handled the open Atlantic swells with ease, her deep keel giving stability that the lighter sloops had lacked. Teach kept her under reduced sail during the first days to allow the crew to settle back into deep water routines after weeks in sheltered waters. The company now numbered close to 300 when counting those who had joined from smaller prizes. Teach divided them into 3 watches to cover the 24 hours without strain. The gun crews remained at their stations, practicing elevation and traverse on floating debris when weather permitted. The articles continued to govern every detail: equal shares, compensation for wounds, and votes on pursuit or course changes. Teach consulted the quartermaster daily on stores and the boatswain on rigging condition. His orders stayed brief and specific, delivered in the same calm voice that had become familiar to every hand. The men responded promptly, knowing that the system rewarded steady work with steady results. They raised the northern Bahamas in early September and cruised the banks for several weeks, taking small coasters that carried useful cargoes, turtle meat, cassava, and occasional barrels of rum from Bermudan traders. One capture brought a load of saltfish that improved the daily meals noticeably. The cook prepared it stewed with onions and peppers when fresh supplies allowed. Teach made it a point to eat the same food as the crew, taking his portion from the common pot at the same time as the others. This small consistency reinforced the shared nature of their existence. No man went short while another had excess. The fleet grew during these months. Teach formed temporary alliances with other captains operating out of Nassau. 2 sloops, one commanded by a man named Stede Bonnet, the other by a former privateer named Richards, joined the Revenge for coordinated operations. The arrangement was simple: sail in company, share intelligence on sightings, and divide prizes according to each vessel's articles when captures were made jointly. Teach met with the other captains by boat when anchored, discussing likely routes and signals for recognition at night. No formal command structure existed above the individual ships. Decisions were made by consensus among the captains, and then carried back to their own companies for approval. Daily life in the loose fleet followed parallel patterns. The Revenge's routine set the standard morning gun drills, constant lookout from the mastheads, and careful navigation using dead reckoning checked against the sun and stars. The Allied sloops matched the pace as best they could, though their smaller size made them more agile in shallow water. When a target appeared, the captains signalled with flags or lanterns, then closed in formation. Teach preferred to lead the approach with the Revenge's heavier armament, letting the sloops cover the flanks. This tactic worked on several occasions. A French snow carrying wine and brandy surrendered after the Revenge fired a single broadside across her bows, and a Spanish packet from Havana yielded silver plate and coin without resistance. The captures during this period were steady but rarely spectacular. One brigantine provided canvas for new sails, another brought iron fittings that the carpenters used to reinforce the Revenge's gun ports. Each prize was stripped efficiently, cargo transferred, papers examined for intelligence, and the vessel released with enough stores for her crew to reach port. Teach continued the practice of allowing captured captains to keep personal effects and navigational instruments. This approach reduced the likelihood of desperate resistance and kept the released crews from exaggerating the violence of the encounters when they reached shore. The stories that circulated in colonial ports described Blackbeard as formidable but not cruel, a reputation that encouraged quicker surrenders. Teach's personal habits remained unchanged amid the growing operations. He rose before dawn to check the deck and the magazine, cleaned his pistols in the first light, and combed his beard while reviewing the night's log. The slow matches were prepared only when action was imminent. He kept them dry in an oilskin pouch and twisted them into his beard just before closing on a target. The effect continued to serve its purpose. Merchant captains who later described the encounter spoke of the smoke-wreathed figure on the quarterdeck, tall and silent, with pistols ready at his belt. The image ended many chases before they began. The Allied sloops brought their own dynamics to the fleet. Bonnet's vessel carried a more mixed crew, including several men who had joined recently from Barbados. Richard's sloop was smaller but fast, often sent ahead to scout. Teach treated both captains as equals, sharing charts and provisions when needed. Joint prizes were divided according to the number of hands on each ship, with the Revenge taking the larger portion due to her size and armament. No disputes arose. The men understood the arithmetic of shares and accepted it as fair. Political currents in the Caribbean remained quiet but shifting. London had finally begun to act on the reports from the colonies. Proclamations offering pardons to pirates who surrendered before a certain date were printed and distributed to governors in Jamaica, Barbados, and the Bahamas. Word of these offers reached Nassau through traders and returning crews. Teach discussed the proclamations with his officers in the great cabin one evening. The general view was sceptical. Past pardons had often been followed by renewed commissions for privateering, but the current ones carried no promise of future employment. The company voted to ignore the offers for the time being and continue operations as before. The fleet ranged farther south in October, cruising the waters off Hispaniola and Puerto Rico. They took a French trader carrying logwood and hides, then a small Spanish sloop with tobacco from Cuba. Each capture added to the stores without major risk. Teach kept the Revenge well supplied, making sure the water casks were topped off whenever a watering place was found. The men stayed healthy overall. Scurvy signs were rare thanks to occasional fresh fruit from captured vessels, and injuries were limited to minor cuts and sprains that healed under the ship's care. Evenings in the fleet brought small exchanges between ships. Men rowed across to visit friends, share rum, or trade small items, needles, tobacco, or pieces of cloth. Teach allowed these visits under strict rules. No weapons carried, no more than a certain number from each ship at once, and return before the midnight watch. The gatherings helped maintain cohesion among the Allied crews. Stories were told, songs sung quietly, and news from Nassau exchanged. Teach rarely joined these visits himself. He preferred the quarterdeck of his own ship, watching the lights of the other vessels across the water and considering the next move. By late autumn, the loose alliance had produced a steady flow of goods back to Nassau. The settlement benefited directly: rum for the taverns, cloth for sails and clothing, iron for repairs. Returning crews spent their shares quickly, then signed on again for the next cruise. Teach's reputation as a commander who kept his ship supplied and his men paid drew more volunteers. He accepted only those who understood the articles and could prove their skill with rope or gun. The Revenge's company remained stable, with experienced hands training the newer ones during quiet periods. The Caribbean campaigns of these months solidified the pattern Teach had established. The fleet moved as a coordinated unit when needed, scattered when pursuing separate targets, and reunited at prearranged anchorages. Captures were consistent, risks controlled, and divisions fair. Teach navigated the operations with the same deliberate care he had always shown, watching the weather, reading the horizon, and keeping the articles at the centre of every decision. The wider world of colonial governors and distant London remained background noise. The immediate reality was the ship, the sea, and the company bound by shared rules. The Queen Anne's Revenge sailed on through the warming waters, her allied sloops keeping station nearby. The campaigns had brought steady profit and growing cohesion. Teach stood at the helm one clear morning as the sun rose behind the distant hills of Hispaniola, feeling the wheel respond to his hands. The life at sea had reached a steady state demanding, practical and entirely their own, Charleston blockade. The decision to head for Charlestown came after weeks of watching fever spread slowly through the company. Several men had taken to their hammocks with chills and sweats, and the surgeon reported that quinine and other supplies were running low. Edward Teach gathered the crew on the main deck of the Queen Anne's Revenge one calm morning in May 1718. He explained the situation plainly. The medicines were not available in Nassau or the smaller settlements, but a large colonial port like Charlestown would have them in its apothecaries and warehouses. The blockade would be short, the demands limited to medical supplies, and a reasonable ransom to cover the delay. No plundering of the town itself, no unnecessary damage. The company voted in favour, seeing the practical need and trusting Teach's record of keeping operations measured. The Revenge and her 2 consort sloops arrived off the bar at the entrance to Charlestown Harbour on May 22. Teach positioned the flagship where she could be seen clearly from the shore but stayed outside the range of the town's small shore batteries. The sloops took flanking stations to cover the channel approaches. No black flag was flown at first. The 3 vessels simply sat there, blocking the main passage in and out. Within hours, local pilots and curious merchants rowed out under flags of truce to inquire. Teach sent one of his own boats back with a written message delivered to the town authorities. The ships required a chest of medicines, including quinine, Jesuit's bark, bandages and surgical tools, along with food and water for the sick men. In exchange, all vessels currently in the harbour would be allowed to leave unmolested, and no further interference would occur. The blockade would lift once the supplies were delivered. Charlestown was then the principal port of South Carolina, busy with rice shipments, indigo, naval stores, and deerskins headed to England. The merchants and planters relied on regular sailings to maintain credit and trade. A prolonged stoppage threatened not only commerce but also the health of the community if fever reached shore. Governor Robert Johnson called his council together quickly. The town had no naval protection beyond a few small armed sloops, and the batteries were not manned in strength for a serious fight. After brief discussion, the decision was made to negotiate rather than resist. Over the next day and a half, small boats moved back and forth under truce. Teach kept his men aboard except for watering parties sent to nearby uninhabited islands. Discipline remained tight. No one was permitted ashore without orders, no shots were fired at passing vessels, and the captured ships already in hand were held quietly at anchor. The sick men received the best available rations, fresh water, broth made from captured livestock, and rest below decks. Teach checked on them personally each day, noting any change in their condition and passing word to the surgeon. On the 3rd day, a sloop came out from the town carrying the requested medicines, along with additional supplies, casks of fresh water, several live cattle, hogs, sheep, and quantities of sugar, flour, and bread. Samuel Ragg, a prominent merchant and member of the Governor's Council who had been aboard one of the small vessels taken earlier in the blockade, was released with his family as part of the agreement. The cargo was transferred to the Revenge without difficulty. Teach inspected the medicines himself to confirm they matched the list, then signalled the consorts to allow passage for any outbound ships. The blockade ended as quietly as it had begun. The 3 pirate vessels weighed anchor that evening and stood out to sea. The entire operation had taken less than 3 days. No shots were exchanged beyond warning guns fired well clear of any hull. No one ashore was harmed, and the town lost only the value of the supplies and the temporary disruption of trade. The released captives, including Rag, carried back accounts of the encounter. A tall captain with a thick black beard, who spoke calmly, kept his men in strict order, and asked for nothing beyond what was needed for his sick. These reports reached print in newspapers as far away as Boston within weeks, adding another layer to the growing stories about Blackbeard. Teach divided the captured livestock and stores among the company according to the articles. The medicines were used immediately on the sick men, who began to improve within days. The cattle and hogs were kept alive on deck for fresh meat as long as possible. The blockade had achieved its purpose without escalating into violence, and the company saw the wisdom in the restraint. Votes on future actions continued to reflect the same preference for efficiency over confrontation. After leaving Charlestown, the fleet cruised northward briefly, before turning back toward the Carolina Sounds. Teach chose to seek a place where the Revenge could be careened, and the hull inspected after months of steady service. They entered Topsail Inlet near what is now Beaufort, North Carolina, in early June. The channel was narrow and shifting, but local knowledge from captured pilots guided them in. The Revenge anchored in a sheltered spot, and the work of unloading stores and preparing to heel the ship began. During the careening, a sudden squall came up while the vessel was heeled over on the beach. The grounding was not catastrophic, but the hull took damage on the bar, and several guns were lost overboard in the confusion. Teach organised the crew to lighten the ship and refloat her, but the damage proved more extensive than first thought. The consort sloops, lighter and undamaged, were able to pull free and stand by. After assessment, Teach made the decision to abandon the Revenge. The company transferred usable stores, guns and powder to the smaller vessels. What could not be salvaged was left behind. Teach then moved to one of the sloops, now carrying a reduced company of about 40 men. The larger ship that had served as flagship for nearly a year was stripped and left aground. The site became a temporary camp while the men rested and planned the next move. Teach kept the same routines: daily checks of stores, fair division of what remained, and consultation with the company on course. The loss of the Revenge was a practical setback, not a defeat. The men still had fast sloops, arms, and the freedom of the coast. The blockade at Charlestown had been the high point of visibility for Teach's operations. It demonstrated how intimidation and negotiation could achieve more than cannon fire. No battle had taken place, only the quiet pressure of armed ships sitting across the harbour mouth. The town had paid what was asked to make the visitors leave. The released captives spread the story. A pirate captain who looked fearsome but acted with calculation, who took what he needed and moved on without burning or looting. Teach spent the weeks after the grounding in quiet preparation. He walked the beach at low tide, examining the stranded hull and noting what might be worth recovering later. His beard remained long and dark, though the slow matches were set aside while ashore. The company around him stayed loyal, bound by the articles and the record of steady shares. Political authorities in the colonies took note of the Charlestown incident. Governor Johnson wrote urgent letters to London describing the event and requesting naval support. The Board of Trade began to discuss more active measures against the pirates of the Bahamas and the American coast. For Teach, the blockade marked a shift. The large flagship was gone, but the experience had confirmed that reputation and careful demands could accomplish goals without heavy fighting. The sloops were faster and more manoeuvrable in the shallow waters he now preferred. The company remained intact, the articles in force, and the sea still open. The next phase would be shorter, closer to shore, and carried out with the same steady approach that had brought him this far. North Carolina. Interlude after. The sloops separated in early September 1718. Edward Teach kept his vessel in the sheltered waters inside Ocracoke Inlet. The company numbered about 40 men now, enough to handle the sloop, but small enough for quick movement through the shallow sounds. Supplies were adequate after the summer captures salt meat, flour, and a small stock of rum, but the men had grown restless after months at sea. Teach gathered them on the deck one morning and laid out the situation plainly. Reports from released captives spoke of a royal proclamation offering pardons to pirates who surrendered to colonial governors before a set date. North Carolina, with its weak administration and distant oversight from London, seemed the most practical place to test the offer. The company voted to sail for Bathtown, the small capital on the mainland, and seek terms from Governor Charles Eden. The sloop made the short run across Pamlico Sound in 2 days of fair winds. Bathtown was then a modest settlement of perhaps 30 wooden houses, a church, a few warehouses, and a landing where small vessels tied up. It sat on a creek that fed into the Sound, far from the main Atlantic trade routes, and even farther from any naval presence. Teach anchored offshore, and went ashore with a small party carrying no weapons beyond sidearms. The governor's residence was a simple frame house near the water. Eden received them without delay. He was a man in his 40s, appointed through political connections in England, and known locally for a relaxed approach to enforcement. Teach presented the pardon proclamation, and stated that he and his men wished to accept its terms. Eden reviewed the papers, asked a few questions about recent activities, and granted the pardon on the spot. No trial, no lengthy inquiry, just a signature, and a fee paid from the company's remaining coins. With the pardon in hand, Teach returned to the sloop and explained the outcome. The men could now go ashore freely in North Carolina without immediate fear of arrest. Most chose to remain with the vessel for the time being, but Teach himself decided to try a period of settled life. He rented a small house on the edge of Bathtown, a one-story structure with a shingled roof, a hearth, and a view across the creek. The building had belonged to a merchant who had moved north. Teach moved in his few personal possessions, a sea chest, his pistols cleaned and oiled, a change of clothes, and the notebook he had kept since his merchant days. For the first time in years he slept in a proper bed rather than a hammock. Daily life in Bathtown moved at a slower pace than anything Teach had known since Bristol. Mornings began with the sound of chickens in the yard and the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer. He rose early out of habit, walked down to the landing to check on the sloop, and returned to brew small beer over the hearth. Food came from local sources, fresh cornbread, smoked ham from nearby farms, oysters gathered at low tide, and occasional venison traded from Tuscarora hunters who visited the town. Clothing changed too. Teach wore plain wool breeches and a linen shirt most days, keeping his sea boots only for muddy paths. His beard remained long but was combed daily without the slow matches that had marked his time at sea. The people around him were a mix of small planters, traders, and artisans who had come to the colony for cheap land and fewer regulations. Governor Eden's circle included a secretary named Tobias Knight, who lived nearby and handled much of the official correspondence. Teach met Knight several times when visiting the governor's house for formalities required after the pardon. Conversations stayed practical discussions of weather, crop prices, and the difficulty of getting goods from England. Teach said little about his past, and the locals asked few questions. A man's history was his own in North Carolina, where many settlers had arrived with stories they preferred not to repeat. Teach developed quiet habits ashore. He spent part of each day repairing tools or mending sails for local boatmen who paid in coin or goods. In the afternoons he walked the paths behind the town, noting the rich soil and the slow-moving creeks that fed the Sound. Evenings found him at a small tavern near the landing, where men gathered to drink cider and talk of land grants or the latest ship arrivals. He nursed a single mug and listened more than he spoke. The political reality of the colony shaped these gatherings. North Carolina had no strong assembly, few taxes collected, and a governor whose salary depended partly on fees and fines. London was far away, and enforcement of trade laws was lax. This looseness had drawn Teach here, and it allowed him to live without immediate pressure. Rumours circulated in Bath about Teach's presence. Some planters claimed he had buried treasure on the Outer Banks. Others said he had married a local girl in a quiet ceremony. Teach neither confirmed nor denied the stories. He kept to himself, maintaining the same steady routines that had served him at sea. His inner calculations turned toward the future. The pardon had removed the immediate threat of hanging, but it offered no steady income. The sloop still lay at anchor with a reduced crew, and the articles remained in force for those who stayed aboard. Teach visited the vessel every few days, ensuring the men were fed and the hull stayed sound. The brief settled period lasted through the autumn months. Teach bought a small plot of land outside town and hired a local man to clear it for possible planting the following spring. He tasted the life of a planter watching the seasons change, feeling the earth under his boots, sharing meals with neighbours who spoke of corn yields and livestock prices. The experience was new but not unwelcome. After years of salt spray and rolling decks, the steady ground and the smell of wood smoke felt solid. Yet old habits remained. He kept his pistols loaded and within reach, checked the horizon each morning for unfamiliar sails, and maintained the quiet watchfulness that had become part of his character. Governor Eden and Secretary Knight continued to treat Teach with courtesy. They invited him to occasional dinners where talk turned to colonial matters, the need for better roads, the threat of Spanish raids on the coast, the slow trickle of new settlers. Teach listened and offered practical observations drawn from his years at sea, the best routes for small vessels, the dangers of shifting inlets, the value of quick communication between settlements. No one pressed him on past activities. The pardon had drawn a line, and both sides respected it. By late October, the company aboard the sloop had grown restless. Some men left for other colonies with their shares. Others signed on to merchant vessels now that they could do so legally. Teach kept a core group of 10 or 12 who preferred the sea life. He made short trips with them into the sounds, checking fishing grounds and watching for opportunities that might arise without breaking the pardon's terms. These excursions were quiet, small hauls of fish or timber, rather than prizes. The articles still guided the division, though on a much smaller scale. The political forces shaping the colony remained fragile. North Carolina's governors had long struggled with distant oversight from the Lords Proprietors in England. Corruption rumours followed Eden, yet no investigation reached the colony. Teach understood the balance. The pardon had been granted quickly because it cost the governor little and kept the peace locally. In return, Teach maintained a low profile. He avoided any action that might force Eden to act against him. The weeks ashore passed steadily. Teach repaired the small house, stacked firewood for the coming winter, and traded with passing vessels for tools and cloth. His beard, once a mark of intimidation at sea, became simply part of his appearance among people who had grown used to seeing tall, quiet men arrive from the water. He developed a taste for local cider and the simple meals of corn, mush and pork that sustained the settlers. The fears that had once centred on storms and shortages now narrowed to practical concerns, whether the land would produce, whether the sloop needed new caulking, whether the pardon would hold if larger naval forces arrived. As November began, Teach felt the pull of the water again. The settled life had given him rest and a taste of stability, but the routines of ship and crew still called. He visited the governor once more to confirm that the pardon remained valid for those who kept the peace. Eden assured him it did. Teach then walked back to the landing, looked out across the sound, and considered the next short cruise. The interlude had been genuine, a period of ordinary days in an ordinary colonial town, but it had not erased the years at sea. The articles, the company and the horizon remained part of who he had become. The house in Bathtown stood ready for his return, the land waited for spring planting, and the neighbours continued their quiet lives. Teach had experienced the other side of the coast, the one without rolling decks or warning shots. It had been calm, practical, and briefly his own, yet the sea still lay open, and the sloop still rode at anchor. The choice of what came next rested with him and the men who had stayed. Turn. To sea. The quiet weeks in Bathtown came to an end in the second week of October, 1718. Edward Teach had kept the small house tidy, stacked firewood against the coming cold, and walked the cleared plot of land each morning to judge the soil. Yet the routines of settler life began to feel narrow. Neighbours spoke of next year's corn planting and the price of hogs, while Teach found himself listening for the sound of sails on the Sound and checking the horizon out of habit. The sloop still lay at anchor with its reduced crew, and the articles that had governed their years together remained in force for those who had stayed. One evening Teach walked down to the landing, looked across the water, and decided the time had come. He told the men who had waited that they would sail again the next morning. No vote was needed. The company understood the shift without discussion. The sloop cleared the creek at first light. Teach had taken back command quietly, resuming the same watch system and the same measured division of stores. The vessel carried about 25 hands, now some of the original company, who had grown restless ashore, plus a few new men from the town who had signed on after hearing the sloop was leaving. Provisions were light: salt pork, cornmeal, and water casks filled from the creek. Rum was issued in the old measured amount. Teach stood at the helm as they threaded the narrow channel out of the Sound, feeling the familiar lift of the deck under his feet. The settled interlude had been real, but the sea felt steadier. They cruised first along the outer banks, staying in the shallow waters where larger ships could not follow. The first capture came 3 days out, a small Virginia coaster carrying barrel staves and salted fish. Teach approached under no colours at first, then raised the black flag only when close enough for the merchant captain to see it clearly. A single warning shot across the bow brought immediate surrender. The cargo was transferred, the vessel released with enough stores for her crew, and the division made according to the articles that same evening. Each man received his share in coin and goods. Teach took his 2 shares openly and stored them in the small cabin. The process felt familiar and right. The company grew over the next weeks as word spread along the coast. Released crews carried news that Blackbeard had returned to sea, and men who had taken the pardon earlier began to drift back toward the Sounds. Teach accepted only those who agreed to the articles and could prove their skill. By mid-November the sloop carried nearly 40 hands again. Daily life settled back into the old pattern: morning deck scrub, gun exercise with the few carriage pieces they still had, constant lookout from the masthead. Meals came from the common pot, now improved slightly by fresh fish caught over the side. Teach walked the deck each evening after the watch changed, checking lashings and speaking briefly with the men. His orders remained quiet and exact. Frustrations with colonial life had played their part in the decision to sail again. Governor Eden had kept his word on the pardon, but pressure from neighbouring colonies had grown. Virginia's Governor Alexander Spotswood had written sharp letters to London and to Eden, complaining that North Carolina had become a safe haven for pirates. Teach heard these reports through traders who visited the sloop. He also noticed that local planters in Bath had begun to keep more distance, their conversations shorter, their offers of trade more cautious. The land he had cleared still waited, but the soil felt less certain when every passing vessel might carry news of naval ships on the way. At sea the risks were known and shared. Ashore the uncertainties came from distant offices and rival governors. Teach kept operations close to the coast and brief. They took several more small prizes in the weeks that followed: coasters carrying naval stores, a fishing smack with dried fish, and one brigantine loaded with sugar from the West Indies. Each encounter followed the same pattern: approach, warning shot, surrender, quick inventory, release. No broadsides were exchanged, no boarding fights occurred. Teach continued the practice of allowing captains to keep their personal instruments and enough provisions to reach port. The released men carried stories northward that added to the reputation without exaggeration. The tall captain with the long black beard who took what he needed and moved on without burning or harming crews. The sloop ranged as far north as the mouth of the Chesapeake and as far south as the Carolina Capes, always returning to the shelter of the Sounds when supplies ran low. Teach chose anchorages carefully, using the shifting inlets that changed with every storm. The men went ashore in small groups to fill water casks and cut firewood, always under orders to leave no trace that might draw attention. Evenings brought the same quiet gatherings on deck, mending clothes, sharpening blades, talking in low voices about the next possible sighting. Teach sat apart at the stern rail most nights, studying the stars for navigation and considering the balance of risk and reward. The pardon had removed the immediate fear of hanging, but it had not changed the basic arithmetic of their life. Steady shares required steady prizes. Political forces continued to press from a distance. Spotswood in Virginia had grown impatient with Eden's leniency and had begun to prepare his own response. He gathered information from merchants and released captives, noting the movements of Teach's sloop. In London, the Board of Trade discussed the problem of the Carolina pirates in general terms, but no squadron had yet been ordered south. North Carolina remained lightly governed, its assembly divided, its militia small. Teach understood the gap between the two colonies. Virginia had stronger trade ties to England and more to lose from disrupted shipping, while North Carolina offered space and fewer questions. This difference had allowed the pardon, but it also made continued operations possible for a time. Daily existence aboard the sloop carried the same practical rhythm. Clothing stayed simple: canvas trousers, checked shirts, bare feet on the warm deck. Teach kept 2 good linen shirts from the Bath period, but wore the older ones at sea. His beard required daily attention. He combed it each morning and tied it back with yarn when handling lines. The slow matches stayed in their pouch, prepared only when a sail appeared on the horizon. The men had grown used to the routine again, and the company held together without strain. When one sailor twisted an ankle during a sail change, the articles provided compensation from the common chest, voted and paid the same day. By the 3rd week of November, the sloop had accumulated enough stores and coin for another period ashore if needed. Teach considered returning to Bath for the winter, repairing the house, and waiting to see whether Spotswood's threats would amount to anything. The men discussed the idea in small groups, but left the final choice to Teach and the articles. He decided to make one more short cruise along the Virginia coast before heading back. The decision was practical. Fresh supplies would make the winter easier, and the sloop needed new cordage that could be taken from a small prize. The return to sea had come naturally after the frustrations of colonial life had accumulated. The planters' days had offered rest and ordinary comforts, but they lacked the direct connection between effort and reward that the articles provided. At sea, every man knew his share depended on the company's work. The political pressures from Virginia added urgency, but did not change the daily calculations. Teach kept the sloop moving, the routine steady, and the horizon open. The brief interlude in Bathtown had shown him another way to live, but the sea remained the place where the life he had built since Bristol still made sense. The sloop sailed on through the late autumn waters, her small company bound by the same rules and the same quiet discipline. Teach stood at the helm one clear morning as the wind freshened from the northeast, feeling the vessel respond under his hands. The coast lay close on the starboard side. The inlets waited behind the banks, and the next sighting would come when it came. The Life had resumed its steady course. Pursuit. By authorities. The return to sea in October 1718 had been quiet but steady. Edward Teach kept the sloop moving along the Carolina coast through November, taking small prizes that kept the company supplied without drawing attention. The captures were few and careful coasters carrying naval stores, fishing boats with dried catch handled with the same measured approach under no colours, black flag raised only when close, warning shot across the bow, surrender, quick transfer of goods, release of the vessel with enough provisions for her crew. No resistance occurred in any of these encounters. Teach continued to allow merchant captains to keep their personal effects and navigational tools. The released men carried word northward that Blackbeard was active again but operating with restraint. Governor Alexander Spotswood of Virginia had followed the reports closely. Spotswood was a military man appointed in 1710, with a reputation for decisive action. He had received detailed accounts of the Charlestown blockade the previous May, and of Teach's pardon in North Carolina. The pardon troubled him most. Spotswood viewed North Carolina as a weak link in colonial defence, a place where pirates could find shelter and supplies while Virginia's trade suffered. By early November, he had gathered intelligence from merchants, released captives, and his own spies along the border. The reports confirmed that Teach had returned to sea after a brief period ashore in Bathtown. Spotswood decided the time had come to act, without waiting for London or cooperation from Governor Eden. Spotswood's plan was direct. He could not send a full naval squadron, none was available in the Chesapeake, but he could use the two small sloops of war already under his command, the Ranger and the Jane, both lightly armed but manned by experienced crews drawn from the Virginia militia and local sailors. He placed Lieutenant Robert Maynard in overall command. Maynard was a seasoned officer in his early 30s, serving on half pay but eager for action. Spotswood briefed him personally in Williamsburg. Find Teach, engage him, and bring him in dead or alive. No pardon from North Carolina would hold against royal authority if the capture occurred in Virginia waters or on the high seas. Maynard was given a proclamation offering a reward £100 for Teach himself, smaller sums for his officers, and instructions to coordinate with any local authorities he encountered. Maynard sailed from Kecoughtan, now Hampton, on November 17 with the two sloops, carrying about 60 men between them. The vessels were small, each around 30 tons, armed with a few carriage guns and swivels, but fast and manoeuvrable. Maynard kept the crews drilled daily, practicing boarding tactics and small arms fire. He carried copies of the royal proclamation and letters from Spotswood authorizing action against pirates in any waters. The sloops shaped a course southward along the coast, stopping at small inlets to question fishermen and traders. By November 21, they had reached the waters near Ocracoke Inlet, where reports placed Teach anchored inside the sound. Teach had chosen Ocracoke for its protected anchorage and narrow entrance. The sloop lay in a shallow bay behind the inlet, with lookouts posted on the high dunes. The company spent the days fishing, mending gear, and resting after the recent short cruises. Teach walked the beach each morning, checking the tides and watching for unfamiliar sails. He knew the pardon offered no real protection if Virginia forces decided to move. The articles remained in force, and the men stayed loyal, but the group was small, around 25 to 30 hands, and the sloop carried only light armament. Teach kept the vessel ready for sea, with stores and powder stowed securely. On the evening of November 21, Maynard's sloops sighted the inlet. They anchored outside the bar to avoid grounding in the dark. Maynard sent a small boat in under cover of night to scout. The lookout returned with confirmation. A sloop matching Teach's description lay at anchor inside. Maynard decided to enter at first light the next day. He divided his men between the two vessels, armed them with cutlasses, pistols, and muskets, and prepared boarding parties. The sloops would approach under British colours to avoid immediate alarm, then close quickly when Teach's sloop was sighted. Teach spent that night ashore with a few men, cooking fresh fish over a driftwood fire. The rest of the company stayed aboard the sloop under the boatswain's watch. He returned before dawn, climbed the side, and checked the deck. The morning was clear, with a light wind from the northeast. Lookouts were posted, guns loaded, and the crew stood to their stations. Teach took the helm himself, ready to weigh anchor if needed. The inlet lay quiet, the sound calm. Maynard's sloops crossed the bar with the rising tide around 8 o'clock. They flew British colours and approached the anchored sloop. Teach saw them from the deck and recognised the threat immediately. He ordered the black flag hoisted and the guns run out. The company numbered fewer than 30. Maynard's force was twice that. Teach kept the sloop at anchor for the moment, letting the approaching vessels close the distance. Maynard hailed across the water, demanding surrender in the name of the king. Teach responded with a shouted refusal and a warning that he would give no quarter. The action began quickly. Maynard's sloops separated to approach from different angles. The Jane, under Maynard's direct command, closed first. Teach's men fired a broadside as she came within range. The shot tore through rigging and killed several men on deck. Maynard ordered return fire, and the two vessels exchanged volleys at close range. The Ranger the second sloop, manoeuvred to cut off escape. Teach tried to weigh anchor and run for the narrow channel, but the wind was light and the sloop moved slowly. Maynard's Jane grappled alongside, and boarding parties poured across. The fight turned hand to hand on the deck. Teach led his men with cutlass and pistol, fighting near the quarterdeck rail. Maynard himself boarded with sword drawn. The close quarters favoured the larger attacking force. Teach was wounded multiple times, cuts to the arms, a pistol ball in the leg, but continued to fight. Accounts from the survivors describe him as formidable even in the last moments. His long beard bloodied, his voice steady as he directed his men. The deck became slippery with blood. Men fell on both sides. Maynard pressed forward, and in the final minutes Teach was surrounded. He was cut down by several blows at once, sword strokes to the neck and body. Maynard later reported that Teach received 5 pistol wounds and 20 sword cuts before he fell. The fight lasted less than half an hour. Teach's men, outnumbered and with their captain dead, threw down their arms. Maynard secured the sloop, took the survivors prisoner, and searched the vessel. He found the usual stores: powder, shot, rum, captured goods, and a few personal items belonging to Teach. A silver cup, a small chest of coins, and the notebook he had kept for years. Maynard ordered the head severed from the body and hung from the bowsprit of the Jane as proof of the capture. The body was thrown overboard according to custom. Maynard sailed back toward Virginia with the prize sloop in tow and the prisoners secured. The head served its purpose. Fishermen and coastal dwellers who saw it spread word quickly. By the time the sloops reached Kecoughtan, the news had reached Williamsburg. Spotswood received Maynard with satisfaction and arranged for the prisoners to be tried under Admiralty law. Most were found guilty and hanged in the following months. Maynard received his reward and promotion. The brief action at Ocracoke ended the active career that had begun in Bristol decades earlier. Teach had commanded vessels of different sizes, from privateer sloops to the captured French ship and back to smaller craft. He had navigated alliances, pardons, and the shifting politics of distant colonies. The final pursuit came from a determined governor who refused to accept the loose arrangements of North Carolina. Maynard's force, though small, was organised and resolute. The body drifted somewhere in the inlet waters. The head was preserved in brine and carried to Virginia as evidence. The notebook, if it survived, passed into some official record and was later lost. The articles that had bound the company dissolved with the capture. The life Teach had shaped practical, direct, governed by shared rules ended in the narrow waters he had chosen for safety. Ocracoke. Battle the morning of the 22nd of November 1718 broke clear over Ocracoke Inlet with a light northeast wind pushing small waves across the sound. Edward Teach had returned to the sloop before first light, after a night ashore with a few men around a driftwood fire. The company numbered about 25 hands fewer than in the summer months, but enough to work the vessel. The sloop lay at anchor in a shallow bay behind the inlet's narrow entrance, her light guns loaded and run out, powder horns filled. Teach stood on the quarterdeck, checking the deck lashings when the lookout called down. 2 sloops crossing the bar, flying British colours, approaching steadily. Teach recognised the threat at once. The vessels were small but well manned, moving with purpose. He ordered the black flag hoisted and the men to stations. The company responded without hesitation. The articles had kept them ready for this. Teach took the helm himself, weighing anchor to position the sloop for a running fight if needed. The wind was too light for quick manoeuvring, and the inlet's shallow channel limited options. He kept the sloop at anchor for the moment, letting the approaching sloops close the distance while his men stood behind the low bulwarks with muskets and cutlasses. Lieutenant Robert Maynard commanded the lead sloop, the Jane, with the Ranger following close behind. Maynard had divided his 60 men into boarding parties, armed with pistols, swords and grenades. He flew British colours to avoid immediate alarm, but as the sloops drew within hailing range, he called across the water demanding surrender in the King's name. Teach responded from the quarterdeck. He would give no quarter and expected none. The exchange was brief. Maynard ordered his sloops to close faster. The action began when the Jane came within pistol shot. Teach's men fired a broadside from the sloop's guns. The shot carried away rigging on the Jane and killed or wounded several men on her deck. Maynard returned fire immediately, his swivels and muskets raking the pirate sloop. The exchange was close and sharp. Teach tried to break for the channel, but the light wind and the anchored position slowed the sloop. Maynard's Jane grappled alongside, hooks biting into the bulwarks. Boarding parties poured across the rail. The fight turned to hand-to-hand work on the crowded deck. Teach led his men from the quarterdeck, cutlass in one hand, pistol in the other. He was wounded early, a pistol ball in the leg, but kept fighting, directing his crew to hold the waist and prevent the attackers from reaching the cabin. Maynard boarded personally, sword drawn, leading a group toward the stern. The deck became slippery with blood. Men fell on both sides from cuts and shots. Teach fought near the rail, using his size and strength to push back boarders. Accounts from survivors describe him as active even under multiple wounds, firing his pistols until empty, then swinging the cutlass in close quarters. The numbers favoured Maynard's force. The pirate sloop's smaller crew could not hold the deck indefinitely. Teach was surrounded near the mast. He received sword cuts to the arms and neck, and another pistol ball struck his body. He continued to fight until several blows landed at once. Maynard himself struck the final sword stroke that brought him down. Teach fell on the quarterdeck, his long beard bloodied, his body marked by 5 pistol wounds and 20 cuts, according to the later report. With their captain dead, the remaining pirates threw down their arms. The fight had lasted less than half an hour. Maynard secured the sloop, took the survivors prisoner, and searched the vessel. The holds contained the usual stores: powder, shot, rum, captured goods, and a few personal items, a silver cup, a small chest of coins, and the worn notebook Teach had kept since his merchant days. Maynard ordered the head severed from the body and suspended from the Jane's bowsprit as proof. The body was thrown overboard into the inlet waters. Maynard then sailed the prize sloop in tow back toward Virginia, the prisoners secured below. The head served its purpose on the return passage. Coastal dwellers who saw it spread word quickly. By the time the sloops reached Kecoughtan, the news had reached Williamsburg. Spotswood received Maynard with satisfaction and arranged for the prisoners to be tried under Admiralty law. Most were convicted and hanged in the following months. Maynard received his reward and promotion. The battle at Ocracoke ended the active phase of Teach's career. The sloop that had carried him since the loss of the Queen Anne's Revenge was taken intact, her guns silent after the final broadside. The company that had followed the articles for years was broken. The inlet returned to its usual quiet, the tides covering the marks of the fight. Teach's death came not in a grand cannon duel, but in close, brutal work on a small deck against a larger force. The years at sea, privateering, piracy, the pardon, the return concluded here in the narrow waters he had chosen for shelter. The political response was immediate in Virginia. Spotswood used the victory to press for stronger measures against the remaining pirates in the Bahamas and the Carolina coast. London took note of the action, though the broader suppression of piracy would take several more years. In North Carolina, Governor Eden faced questions about the pardon he had granted, but no formal inquiry followed. The battle marked a practical end to the loose arrangements that had allowed Teach to operate along the coast. The inlet waters carried on as before, the sound calm under the late autumn sky. The sloop that had been Teach's last command was towed away, her deck cleaned of blood, her stores inventoried. The life he had shaped, governed by articles, sustained by steady routines, ended with the fall of its captain. The horizon remained open for others, but for Edward Teach it closed here. Death and legacy. The body of Edward Teach drifted in the waters of Ocracoke Inlet after the fight on the 22nd of November 1718. Lieutenant Robert Maynard's men had severed the head and hung it from the bowsprit of the Jane as proof of the kill. The head was preserved in brine during the return passage to Virginia, shown to coastal inhabitants who gathered at landings to see it. By the time Maynard reached Kecoughtan, the news had spread through the colony. Blackbeard was dead, killed in action against a royal force. Governor Alexander Spotswood received the report with satisfaction and arranged for the head to be displayed in a prominent place in Williamsburg as a warning. It remained there for some time, a grim reminder of the cost of piracy. The prisoners, those of Teach's company who had survived the boarding, were taken to Virginia under guard. They numbered fewer than 20. Maynard and Spotswood arranged for their trial under Admiralty law in Williamsburg. The proceedings were swift. Most were found guilty of piracy and sentenced to death. Executions followed in the months after the battle, carried out publicly. The men who had signed the articles, shared the prizes, and followed Teach through the years at sea, met their end on the gallows. A few received pardons or lighter sentences due to youth or evidence of coercion, but the majority did not escape the rope. In North Carolina, the reaction was mixed. Governor Charles Eden faced questions from neighbouring colonies about the pardon he had granted Teach earlier that year. Eden defended his actions by pointing to the royal proclamation that had authorised such pardons, but the scrutiny added pressure. No formal charges were brought against him, and the matter faded as other concerns took precedence. Bathtown returned to its quiet routines. The small house Teach had rented stood empty for a time, then was taken by another settler. The plot of land he had cleared remained uncultivated through the winter. The immediate aftermath in the wider Atlantic world was practical rather than dramatic. London received word of the action through Spotswood's dispatches. The Board of Trade noted the success as part of the ongoing effort to suppress piracy in American waters. No grand celebrations followed in England. The event was one of several similar actions against the remaining pirate captains in the Bahamas and Caribbean. The golden age of piracy, which had flourished in the years after the War of the Spanish Succession, was already winding down. Naval patrols increased, pardons were offered and then withdrawn, and governors grew less tolerant of loose arrangements along the coast. Stories of Teach began to circulate almost immediately. Released captives from earlier captures, survivors from the Ocracoke fight, and sailors in taverns from Boston to Bridgetown added details with each telling. The burning fuses in the beard became a standard element, the towering figure with pistols crossed at his belt, a familiar image. Newspapers in the colonies printed accounts of the Charlestown blockade, the pardon in Bath, and the final battle. These reports were factual at first, drawn from official letters and trial records, but they carried the weight of the man's reputation. By 1724, Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates appeared in London. The book collected accounts of several pirate captains, with a substantial section devoted to Teach. Johnson drew on earlier reports, trial testimony, and the stories that had spread through the maritime world. The narrative, mixed verified facts, the capture of La Concorde, the renaming to Queen Anne's Revenge, the Charlestown blockade, the pardon, the grounding, and the Ocracoke fight with embellishments that made the figure more vivid. Teach was portrayed as a larger-than-life captain who struck fear with his appearance alone, commanded through intimidation rather than cruelty, and died in a fierce last stand. The book became widely read and reprinted, fixing the image of Blackbeard in print for generations. The legends grew from there. Treasure stories attached themselves quickly. Buried silver on the Outer Banks, gold hidden in Carolina inlets, even claims that Teach had left maps or marked trees. Locals in Bath and Ocracoke repeated tales of sightings or strange lights years after his death. These stories were not based on evidence. Maynard's search of the sloop found only modest coin and stores, but they persisted because the name carried weight. The figure of Blackbeard became a symbol of the brief period when piracy had flourished openly in American waters, a time when men who had fought in the late war could turn their skills to their own account. The historical impact was clear in the years that followed. The action at Ocracoke, combined with other naval operations against pirates in the Bahamas, helped close the chapter. Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau in 1718 with a royal commission to suppress piracy there, offering pardons and enforcing order. The loose community that had formed on New Providence dispersed. Former pirates either accepted pardons and returned to merchant service, were hunted down, or drifted to other regions. The trade routes became safer, convoys more regular, and colonial governors less willing to overlook violations. Teach's career had spanned the transition from privateering to outright piracy and back to a brief attempt at legitimacy. He had commanded vessels of different sizes, formed alliances, navigated pardons, and returned to sea when conditions required it. The articles that governed his companies had provided structure in a lawless environment, ensuring fair division and shared risk. His approach favouring intimidation over prolonged fighting had kept casualties low on both sides and allowed steady operations. The final battle came against a determined opponent who had prepared carefully and struck when the odds favoured him. In the broader sweep of history, Teach marked the end of an era. The golden age of piracy lasted roughly a decade, fueled by post-war unemployment among sailors and the lack of strong authority in distant colonies. It ended as naval power reasserted itself, pardons were withdrawn, and trade resumed under stricter control. Blackbeard became the most famous figure from that brief period, his name and image enduring long after the facts had settled. The inlet at Ocracoke returned to its natural quiet. The tides continued to shift the sandbars, the Sound lay calm under changing skies. The house in Bathtown stood occupied by others. The land Teach had cleared grew over with weeds and then crops. The sea carried on, the trade routes filled with merchantmen again, and the stories of the tall captain with the black beard passed into print and memory. The life that had begun in Bristol with ropes and tar ended in the waters of North Carolina. The man who had learned the sea, commanded vessels, shared prizes, and lived by articles of his own making left behind a name that outlasted the events. The history of piracy in the Atlantic moved forward without him, but the figure of Blackbeard remained fixed in the accounts that followed. The weeks and months after the battle brought a slow return to ordinary patterns along the coast. Virginia's trade resumed without the shadow of Teach's sloop. North Carolina's small ports continued their quiet business. The stories persisted in taverns and on decks, growing with each retelling. The man himself had passed into the water, but the name endured, carried on the wind across the same seas he had sailed.